In September 1944, after the breakout from Normandy and the rapid advance across France and Belgium, Allied commanders faced a logistical ceiling. Fuel depots lagged behind advancing armored divisions. A single armored division could consume over 100,000 gallons of gasoline in a day of sustained operations. Rail lines had been shattered by months of bombing. Truck convoys carried hundreds of tons of supplies forward, but demand outpaced delivery. The front stretched thin. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a concentrated thrust into the Netherlands. The plan fractured into two components: Market, the airborne assault; Garden, the ground advance. Over 30,000 paratroopers from American and British airborne divisions would drop behind German lines to seize bridges over a series of rivers and canals. Ground forces would then drive north along a narrow corridor, linking each bridge in sequence and crossing the Rhine into Germany. The airborne element required precision measured in minutes and miles. Aircraft numbering in the thousands lifted paratroopers and gliders carrying jeeps, anti-tank guns, and artillery pieces weighing several thousand pounds. Landing zones were selected based on terrain and proximity to objectives, yet some were located miles from critical bridges due to anti-aircraft threats. Each additional mile introduced friction. On the ground, the primary thrust relied on a single highway, later nicknamed Hell's Highway. British armored units advanced along this elevated road, flanked by low-lying fields. A tank weighing over 30 tons could not easily maneuver off-road without risking bogging down in soft ground. German forces, though battered from previous campaigns, regrouped faster than Allied planners had projected. Elements of two SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem, with tanks whose armor measured several inches thick and guns capable of penetrating Allied vehicles at range. Inside a British tank inching north, the crew felt the vibration of the engine reverberate through steel. Infantry rode atop hulls, exposed to sniper fire and artillery fragments. When a lead vehicle was disabled, the column stalled. The highway narrowed to a single usable lane in many sections. Traffic congestion fractured tempo. German counterattacks severed the road repeatedly, forcing engineers and infantry to reclaim sections under fire. At Arnhem, British airborne troops faced concentrated resistance around the bridge that formed the final objective. They lacked heavy anti-tank weaponry sufficient to counter German armor effectively. Casualty rates among certain battalions exceeded 60% over days of fighting. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Medical stations overflowed in buildings whose brick walls provided limited protection against artillery shells weighing more than 20 pounds each. When I examined original British airborne after-action reports alongside German unit diaries from the Arnhem sector, one detail stood out. German commanders were initially uncertain of Allied scale and intent. Yet once armored units consolidated, they recalibrated quickly, isolating airborne pockets and concentrating firepower against them. The Allied timetable, measured in days, eroded hour by hour. The American airborne divisions farther south seized several bridges successfully. Yet the cumulative effect of delays along the corridor prevented relief of the British at Arnhem in time. River crossings required bridging equipment measured in tons. Engineers labored under artillery fire to repair damaged spans. Each pause allowed German units to collide against exposed flanks. Operation Market Garden aimed to outpace German recovery and penetrate into the Ruhr industrial region before winter. Instead, it stalled short of the final bridge. The British 1st Airborne Division suffered catastrophic losses. Of roughly 10,000 men deployed near Arnhem, only a fraction returned across the river after withdrawal. Equipment was destroyed or abandoned. German defensive cohesion, though strained, did not fracture. The failure did not erase Allied strength. Industrial production in the United States and Britain continued at high volume. Tank factories produced thousands of vehicles annually. Shipyards launched vessels measured in tens of thousands of tons. Yet Market Garden revealed that concentration along a single narrow axis carried risk when opposition remained capable of rapid counteraction. The operation failed because it relied on extended supply lines along one road, underestimated German armored presence near Arnhem and required synchronization across air and ground components under compressed timelines. When one segment stalled, the entire chain eroded. If you are listening now, perhaps in the quiet stretch before sleep, picture that highway stretching north through Dutch fields. Vehicles nose to tail, engines idling, men watching tree lines for movement. Imagine airborne soldiers holding positions in brick houses near a river they cannot cross. The plan was drawn straight, but the road bent under pressure. Let that steady image soften your thoughts. This is the entire history of the Battle of Market Garden. Chapter 1. The Missing Inventory Sheet. The 10th of September, 1944. A requisition office in Brussels, barely a week liberated, where the smell of mimeograph fluid mixed with cigarette smoke and the particular staleness of military paperwork. Lieutenant James Langton sat at a desk that had belonged to a Belgian insurance clerk 3 months earlier, running his fountain pen down a column of numbers that refused to reconcile. Outside, you could hear the rumble of lorries moving supplies forward, the sound of an army that believed it was winning. Inside, Langton was discovering that the mathematics of victory didn't add up. Form B114, Allied Expeditionary Force Supply Chain, lay in front of him with its neat rows for requisitions and authorizations. Someone had written in the margin, in that same blue fountain ink, "Shortfall, 1,400 lorries. Fuel priority given to Patton. Request denied." The word "denied" was underlined 3 times, each stroke slightly heavier than the last, the kind of emphasis you make when you know no one is listening. Market Garden, the operation that would become the largest airborne assault in history, was being planned in conference rooms across Belgium and southern England, where generals moved colored pins across maps and spoke in terms of strategic breakthrough and rapid exploitation. But here, in this requisition office, the reality was being written in different terms. Langton's job was unglamorous. He was responsible for tracking the vehicle requirements for 30th Corps, the armored force that would drive up a single highway to relieve the paratroopers dropping at Arnhem. The plan called for a dash of more than 60 miles in less than 48 hours, pushing through defended territory on one road. When Langton ran the calculations, vehicle density, fuel consumption, maintenance requirements, he kept arriving at the same conclusion. They didn't have enough trucks, not nearly enough. The shortfall wasn't marginal, it was structural. What strikes me as remarkable, looking back through these supply documents, is how clearly the problem was identified and how completely it was ignored. Langton wasn't guessing. He had the exact figures. The 14th of September brought a flurry of signals between Brussels and Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles. Langton's superior had elevated the truck shortage to division level, hoping someone with more authority could shake loose the vehicles they needed. The response came back the same day, typed on the standard signal form, with its carbon copies going to a dozen different offices.
Request noted. Transportation assets committed to Third Army operations. No reallocation available at this time.
Third Army meant Patton, driving east toward the German frontier, consuming fuel and vehicles at a rate that made Montgomery's planners and 21st Army Group quietly furious. The Americans had priority. The British would make do. This wasn't a matter of rivalry or ego, or at least it wasn't only that. The Allied supply situation in early September 1944 was genuinely desperate. Everything still came through the beaches of Normandy or the hastily repaired port of Cherbourg, then traveled hundreds of miles by truck to reach the advancing armies. There simply weren't enough vehicles to go around. Someone had to be shorted. On the 10th of September, that someone was Market Garden. Langton's records show he requisitioned 1,400 Bedford QL lorries, the standard British 3-ton cargo truck, workhorse of the supply columns. Each lorry could carry roughly 3 3/4 tons of supplies or fuel. Do the arithmetic. 1,400 vehicles multiplied by 3.75 tons equals 5,250 tons of carrying capacity. That was the missing margin. Without those trucks, 30th Corps would have to operate with ammunition dumps 40% below the planned level and fuel reserves stretched dangerously thin. The Bedford QL had one other characteristic worth noting. At highway speeds, fully laden, it consumed fuel at roughly 8 miles per gallon. That meant each truck needed refueling every 64 miles. The distance from the Belgian border to Arnhem was 64 miles. The mathematics were elegant in their brutality. A single road advance would require fuel dumps positioned along the entire route, and the very trucks needed to establish those dumps were the ones that had been denied. It fascinates me how no one in the planning documents addresses this circular dependency. They simply assumed the trucks would materialize. The planning documents from Leopoldsburg, where Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks briefed his division commanders on the 14th of September, make no mention of the supply constraints. Horrocks was a charismatic commander, popular with his troops, known for his aggressive optimism. His presentation that day focused on speed and momentum. Punch through the initial German defenses, race up the highway before the enemy could react. Link up with the airborne forces holding the bridges. The war diary kept by Major General Alan Adair of the Guards Armored Division records Horrocks' briefing in enthusiastic terms. Rapid exploitation, limited opposition, breakthrough to the Zuider Zee. Nowhere in Adair's notes is there any discussion of what happens if the advance stalls, if the single road becomes congested, if German resistance proves stronger than expected. The assumption was that speed would solve everything. But speed requires fuel, and fuel requires trucks, and the trucks weren't there. By the 16th of September, the day before the operation launched, the supply dumps had been established at Borg Leopold, positioned as close to the German border as the Allied advance allowed. The quartermaster returns, those mundane documents that track tons of ammunition and gallons of fuel with bureaucratic precision, tell us exactly what was stockpiled. 4,762 tons of ammunition sat in those dumps, organized by caliber and type: artillery shells, mortar rounds, small arms cartridges, anti-tank projectiles. 4,762 tons. The operational plan called for 7,200 tons. The missing 2,438 tons represented exactly the carrying capacity of 1,400 3-ton lorries. Langton's denied requisition had a physical manifestation now. Specific shells that weren't there, specific crates that didn't exist. When I cross-reference the ammunition expenditure rates from the after-action reports with the initial stockpile figures, the shortfall becomes even more stark. 30th Corps would have enough ammunition for roughly 60 hours of sustained combat operations. The operational timeline allocated 48 hours to reach Arnhem. That left a 12-hour margin for error. 12 hours. The fuel situation was equally constrained. The dumps held approximately 280,000 gallons of petrol, distributed among multiple sites to minimize the risk of a single German air raid destroying everything. A Sherman tank consumed roughly 3 gallons of fuel per mile of cross-country movement, somewhat less on paved roads. The Guards Armored Division fielded approximately 190 Sherman tanks, plus reconnaissance vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and the essential truck columns carrying infantry and supplies. Conservative estimates put the fuel consumption for a 60-mile advance at over 400,000 gallons, assuming no delays, no detours, no extended idling and traffic jams. They had 280,000. The deficit, 120,000 gallons, would have to come from somewhere. The plan assumed that captured German fuel dumps could be seized and used, a risky assumption given that the Wehrmacht had been retreating so rapidly they'd been burning their own supply depots to deny them to the Allies. There's a curious detail in the transportation logs that surfaced only when researchers gained access to the American archives decades later. On the 13th of September, Langton's truck requisition was actually approved. Someone at Supreme Headquarters, reviewing the critical nature of Market Garden, authorized the reallocation of 823 vehicles from reserve status to 21st Army Group. 823 wasn't 1,400, but it would have helped. The authorization was sent by signal, the trucks were manifested, and then nothing. The vehicles were in Le Havre, 280 miles to the west. Getting them forward would require drivers, fuel for the move, and coordination with the port transportation officers, who were already overwhelmed moving supplies for Patton's Third Army. By the time the authorization was cut, it was too late. The trucks were still sitting in Le Havre when Market Garden launched on the 17th of September. They arrived in Belgium on the 23rd, the day after Arnhem had already been cut off. The irony embedded in these supply documents is almost architectural in its precision. Market Garden was conceived as an operation to bypass the grinding logistics of a broad front advance. Churchill and Montgomery both spoke of it as a dagger thrust into the German heartland, a rapid exploitation that would avoid the slow, methodical infantry battles that consumed ammunition and fuel at unsustainable rates. The idea was that airborne troops, dropped deep behind German lines, would seize key bridges and hold them just long enough for armored columns to race through before German defenses could solidify. Speed would compensate for supply constraints. Audacity would trump logistics. But the operation itself required perfect logistics to enable that speed. The single road that 30th Corps would use, Highway 69 running from the Belgian border, through Eindhoven and Nijmegen to Arnhem, had to be kept open, supplied, and flowing. Any interruption, any delay, any moment where the column stopped moving, and the whole intricate timetable would collapse. You couldn't wish trucks into existence. You couldn't conjure ammunition from optimism. Langton's marginal notation, request denied, appears on 17 separate requisition forms in the archives, each one tracking a different shortfall. Radios, mine-clearing equipment, bridging supplies, medical stocks. The pattern repeats across all the logistics branches. Requests made, shortfalls identified, solutions proposed, requests denied. Not because the planners were incompetent or careless, but because the supply situation was genuinely impossible. Every unit in northwestern Europe was operating below establishment, making do with less than they needed, hoping that enemy weakness would compensate for Allied shortage. Most of the time, it did. The Wehrmacht in September 1944 was a hollowed-out force, retreating in disorder, losing equipment faster than German factories could replace it. Allied superiority in almost every category, tanks, aircraft, artillery, meant that even undersupplied units could win their battles. But Market Garden wasn't most operations. It demanded perfection. It required every element to function exactly as planned, with no delays and no mistakes. And it was built on a supply foundation that was already crumbling before the first paratrooper boarded his aircraft. The missing inventory sheet, Form B114, with its neat columns and desperate marginalia, told that story. No one wanted to read it. Chapter 2. The Photographs. Browning didn't see the 12th of September, 1944, 15:20 hours. A Supermarine Spitfire, modified for photographic reconnaissance, banked over the Dutch countryside at 26,000 feet, its cameras clicking in mechanical rhythm as the pilot flew a precise grid pattern over the town of Oosterbeek and the surrounding forests. Below, invisible from that altitude, German troops were moving vehicles under tree cover, reorganizing units that had been shattered in the long retreat from France. The cameras couldn't see intent or capture organizational structure, but they recorded what was there: dark shapes under camouflage netting, long-barreled vehicles that suggested armor, the geometric patterns of field encampments. By 1700 hours, the film canisters were on their way to Royal Air Force Medmenham, the interpretation center west of London, where teams of specialists turned aerial negatives into intelligence assessments. Flight Lieutenant Tony Hill's section received them the next morning. Medmenham operated with the bureaucratic efficiency of a factory, which in a sense it was. A factory for converting raw visual data into typed reports that moved up the chain of command. The process was supposed to be objective. Interpreters examined the photographs under magnification, identified objects based on standardized criteria, recorded their findings in neutral language, and forwarded their assessments without editorial comment. But intelligence is never truly objective. Every step involves judgment calls. What's visible versus what's merely possible? What confidence level to assign? What language makes it into the final report? Hill was looking at contact print 4062/4419, a slightly oblique image taken from the southeast that showed a clearing in the woods near Oosterbeek. In pencil, someone, likely Hill himself, had written along the margin, "POS, armor, count 6 to 8 vehicles with long barrels." The word possible had been crossed out and replaced with probable. That correction, made in the moment of analysis, never appeared in the typed intelligence summary that went to higher headquarters. The intelligence summary that reached 1st Airborne Corps headquarters was typed on standard format INT/452, dated the 13th of September. The language had been carefully smoothed. Possible enemy armor in Arnhem area, identity uncertain, estimated 6 to 8 vehicles. Possible, not probable. Uncertain, not confirmed. The photographs showed what they showed, but the words surrounding those images shaped how commanders would interpret them. Major Brian Urquhart, not related to Major General Roy Urquhart, who would command the division at Arnhem, was the intelligence officer for 1st Airborne Corps. He saw the photographs and the language and understood immediately what it meant. German armor, potentially including tanks, within 8 miles of the planned drop zones. Urquhart requested an immediate briefing with Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, the Corps commander. What happened in that meeting remains one of the contested moments in Market Garden's history. Urquhart's post-war accounts claim he showed the photographs directly to Browning, argued that they represented an unacceptable risk, and urged reconsideration of the drop zones. Browning's aide-de-camp kept a daily diary. There is no mention of this meeting. The archives contain 2 versions of reality, and I've spent considerable time trying to reconcile them. Either Urquhart met with Browning and the meeting went unrecorded, possible, but unusual for a headquarters that documented everything, or Urquhart's memory conflated multiple briefings into a single, dramatic confrontation that didn't happen quite as he remembered. Memory is unreliable, especially when filtered through decades of guilt and second-guessing. What's certain is that the intelligence summary reached Browning's desk, and Browning did nothing to halt or modify the operation. The photographs existed, the assessment existed, the warning existed, and it went nowhere. By the 15th of September, when final commanders' briefings were held at Moore Park, the intelligence picture had been sanitized further. The minutes from that meeting record the intelligence officer stating, "No significant enemy formations in operational area." Not no armor, but no significant formations. The armor was acknowledged, but dismissed as insignificant. The Germans had 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting in the Arnhem area, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. These weren't full-strength armored divisions. They'd been mauled in Normandy and were in the Netherlands precisely because they needed time to absorb replacements and repair equipment. But refitting didn't mean harmless. Post-war analysis of German strength returns shows that 9th SS Panzer had 47 operational armored vehicles on the 17th of September. A mix of Panther tanks, Panzerführer S, Stug assault guns, and armored reconnaissance vehicles. 47 vehicles isn't a full-strength Panzer division, which would have over 200 tanks at establishment. But 47 armored vehicles with trained crews and aggressive commanders was more than enough to cause havoc among lightly armed paratroopers, whose heaviest weapons were 6-pounder anti-tank guns and Piat launchers. The intelligence was accurate. The assessment was wrong. There's another layer to this story that only emerged when researchers gained access to the RAF photographic archives in the 1980s and could compare the original contact prints with the type summaries. Hill's section at Medmenham had produced 3 separate photo interpretation reports between the 6th and 12th of September, each one noting the presence of armored vehicles in the Arnhem area. The language varied: possible tanks, probable armor, vehicles with long gun barrels, But the consistent message was that something with tracks and guns was there. The challenge for photo interpreters was positive identification. Aerial reconnaissance could show you a vehicle, but definitively identifying it as a Panther tank versus a Stug assault gun versus a half-track with a long-barreled anti-tank gun required either very clear imagery or corroborating intelligence. The standard protocol was to cross-reference vertical reconnaissance with oblique photography, images taken from an angle rather than straight down, which provided better detail on vehicle profiles. But only 40% of the market garden reconnaissance missions included oblique passes. The rest were vertical shots, optimized for mapping rather than vehicle identification. When I examine Hill's notations on the contact prints alongside the typed summaries that went forward, the filtering process becomes visible. Hill saw enough detail to cross out possible and write probable. That's a confidence judgment based on professional experience. But by the time the information traveled up through the intelligence hierarchy, uncertainty had been reintroduced. This wasn't necessarily malicious. Intelligence officers are trained to be cautious about overstating threats, especially when photo evidence is ambiguous. The problem was that the operational planners wanted certainty, and in the absence of certainty, they defaulted to optimism. If the photographs didn't definitively prove the presence of German armor, then the armor could be assumed to be absent or insignificant. This is confirmation bias operating at the institutional level. An operation had already been approved and resourced, and inconvenient intelligence was interpreted through the lens of operational commitment. There's one more document that adds complexity to this story. A report from the Dutch resistance, filed through the Special Operations Executive Network on the 14th of September. A Belgian intermediary passed along information from contacts in the Arnhem area. German tanks, possibly for repair, had been observed near the city. The report was logged, assigned a file number, 892/NL, and distributed to exactly 3 officers at Supreme Headquarters. It never reached 1st Airborne Corps. The resistance report wasn't considered reliable enough for operational planning because the sources couldn't be verified and the details were vague. Tanks, possibly for repair, could mean anything from a few broken-down vehicles awaiting towing to a full repair depot. Without corroboration, the report was filed as for information only, rather than actionable intelligence. But combined with Hill's photographs, it should have been corroboration. 2 independent sources, aerial reconnaissance and human intelligence, both reporting armor near Arnhem. That should have triggered alarm. The intelligence breakdown at Market Garden wasn't a failure of collection. The reconnaissance aircraft flew their missions. The photo interpreters examined the images. The resistance networks reported what they saw. The raw intelligence was there. What failed was synthesis and distribution. Information existed in separate channels: RAF photographic reconnaissance, SOE human intelligence, radio intercepts from ultra decrypts, but no mechanism existed to integrate all of it into a coherent warning that could override operational momentum. Major Brian Urquhart tried to be that mechanism. He saw the photographs and understood their implications and attempted to halt or modify the operation. But one major, however correct, couldn't stop a plan that had the backing of Montgomery, Eisenhower, and Churchill. Urquhart was sent on medical leave, officially for exhaustion, though he believed it was to remove a troublesome voice. He wasn't there when the operation launched. By the 16th of September, the intelligence picture was frozen. No new assessments would be issued before the operation began the next morning. The paratroopers boarding their aircraft at airfields across southern England had been briefed that they faced limited German opposition. Demoralized infantry, perhaps some improvised battle groups formed from retreating units. Nothing that airborne troops couldn't handle. No one mentioned the 47 armored vehicles. No one mentioned Hill's photographs or the resistance reports. The information existed somewhere in the system, filed and logged and documented. But it didn't reach the men who needed it. Contact print 4062/4419 remains in the archives at Q, Hill's penciled notations still visible along the margin. Probable armor, 6 to 8 vehicles. The photograph doesn't lie, but the system around the photograph created a lie of omission. And on the 17th of September, 1st Airborne Division jumped into a reality that their intelligence summaries had denied existed. Chapter 3. The Single Road. The engineering specifications for Highway 69, the route from Eindhoven north through Wegel to Arnhem, were published by the Dutch Provincial Road Authority in 1936. Carriageway width, 5.2 meters, paved with concrete sections designed for civilian traffic patterns. Maximum load rating, 12 tons per vehicle, assuming proper weight distribution. No shoulders to speak of, just soft verges that transition directly into drainage ditches or agricultural fields. The highway had been built for trucks hauling produce to market and passenger vehicles traveling between cities at leisurely speeds. On the 13th of September 1944, a Dutch civil engineer named Jan van der Veer sat in a British Corps headquarters looking at maps of this highway and trying to explain to military planners why their operation was physically impossible. Van der Veer had been working with British engineers since the liberation of Brussels, translating pre-war Dutch infrastructure records and providing technical assessments of bridges, roads, and rail lines. His job was unglamorous but essential, determining whether specific routes could support military traffic. When someone showed him the proposed route for Operation Market Garden, a single highway running 64 miles from the Belgian border to Arnhem, he immediately pulled the construction files. What he found wasn't encouraging. He drafted a memorandum to the 30th Corps' Engineering Section, dated the 13th of September. The text was precise and technical, free of military jargon. Road 69, Eindhoven to Wegel section. 5.2 meters carriageway, no shoulders, soft verges. Bailey Bridge load class 40. Your Sherman tanks are class 50. Respectfully request alternate routes. The reply was typed at the bottom of the same page. Noted, no alternatives available. Not, we'll address this, or, we'll modify the plan. Just noted, as if acknowledging the problem somehow resolved it. The mathematics of road capacity aren't complicated, but they're inflexible. A Sherman tank with crew and fuel weighed 33.3 tons, well above the 12-ton rating for which Highway 69 had been designed. More critically, a Sherman was 2.62 meters wide. On a 5.2-meter road, that left 1.29 meters of clearance on each side. 64.5 centimeters. In theory, two Shermans could pass each other with room to spare. In practice, no tank commander would attempt that at any speed greater than a crawl, and only in daylight with clear visibility. The soft verges meant that any vehicle straying off the pavement would immediately bog down in the Dutch polder soil, which had the consistency of wet clay. Van der Veer's memo didn't just note the width problem. He included the structural concern. Every passage of a 33-ton vehicle over pavement designed for 12-ton loads caused cumulative damage. The concrete wouldn't shatter immediately, but it would crack, spall, and eventually fail. How many tanks could the road support before the surface degraded? Van der Veer didn't have a precise answer, but he knew it wasn't infinite. The Corps Engineers Conference on the 14th of September, recorded in the War Diary of 615 Field Squadron, Royal Engineers, focused primarily on bridging operations. The assumption was that German forces, retreating through the Netherlands, would demolish bridges behind them to slow Allied pursuit. British engineers would need to replace those bridges with Bailey equipment, prefabricated steel components that could be assembled on site to span gaps. Bailey bridges were brilliant pieces of engineering, modular and adaptable, but they had load classifications. An H2/40 configuration, the standard design for medium-span bridges, was rated to carry 40 tons. Sherman tanks were class 50, meaning they exceeded the bridge's safe capacity. Engineers could reinforce the structure or limit traffic to one tank at a time, but either solution slowed movement. What's striking about the conference minutes is what they don't discuss: Van der Veer's road width measurements. The focus was entirely on vertical load capacity for bridges, not horizontal clearance on highways. The implicit assumption seemed to be that if the road was paved, it was adequate. Van der Veer's concerns went beyond load capacity. The Germans had modified the road during their occupation, though not in ways immediately visible on Allied maps. In 1943, anticipating eventual Allied attacks, German engineers had deliberately removed drainage culverts at several points along Highway 69. Without proper drainage, water accumulated in the fields adjacent to the road, creating marshy conditions that reduced the effective width of any bypass. If the paved surface became impassable, blocked by a destroyed vehicle or a crater, there was no way around. The road was effectively uncircumventable, a word I keep returning to because it captures the operational reality better than single lane or narrow. You couldn't bypass obstacles. You could only wait for them to be cleared, and every minute of waiting was a minute lost from the impossibly tight schedule. The distance from the Belgian border to Arnhem was 64 miles. The operational plan allocated 48 hours for 30th Corps to cover that distance, link up with the airborne forces, and secure all the bridges. That worked out to an average speed of 1.33 miles per hour. Faster than walking pace, but not by much. The planners knew this. They accounted for the slow pace by assuming that once the initial German defenses were broken at the border, the column would accelerate. German resistance would be light. The roads would be clear. The bridges would be intact or quickly replaced. Every assumption depended on every other assumption being true. Van der Veer's memo represented a challenge to the foundation. Even without German resistance, the road itself was a constraint. Highway 69 couldn't physically support the traffic density required for the operation. The column would stretch back for miles, vehicles advancing in single file, and any disruption anywhere along the route would cause cascading delays. When I map out the traffic density calculations, the numbers become almost surreal in their impossibility. 30th Corps comprised roughly 20,000 vehicles of various types: tanks, armored cars, trucks, artillery pieces, ambulances, command vehicles, and motorcycles. Not all of those vehicles would be on Highway 69 simultaneously. Units would move in serials, with spacing between formations, but even a fraction of that total created a traffic management nightmare. British doctrine called for 50 meters of spacing between vehicles during tactical movement to minimize the risk of a single artillery strike destroying multiple vehicles. 20,000 vehicles with 50-meter spacing equals 1,000 kilometers of linear road space, far longer than the 64-mile route. Even compressed into tighter spacing, the column would stretch back into Belgium. And this assumes every vehicle moves continuously at the same speed with perfect coordination, which never happens in war. The Bailey Bridge problem compounded everything. Major William Murray's diary, written while he commanded an engineer detachment, records the bridge construction timeline at Son, where the Germans destroyed the highway bridge on the 17th of September. Murray's unit arrived with Bailey equipment at 2 in the morning on the 18th. Standard procedure for an H2/40 span was to assemble the bridge in 6 hours using 6-man teams working in rotation. But Murray didn't have floodlights. Blackout regulations prevented large-scale illumination at night. And he didn't have cranes. Everything had to be hand-assembled in darkness using only moonlight and shielded flashlights. The bridge took 14 hours to complete, 14 hours during which the entire advance halted because there was no way forward and no way around. Van der Veer's measurements showed that even a successfully installed Bailey Bridge would create a bottleneck. The approaches had to be graded, vehicles would slow to crossing speed, and the bridge itself could only handle 1 tank at a time. Every bridge became a choke point. The German modifications to Highway 69 weren't random acts of vandalism. They were deliberate tactical measures. By removing 40 centimeters of effective road width through drainage manipulation, they ensured that any Allied force using the highway would be canalized, forced into a predictable, narrow corridor with no room for maneuver. Van der Veer noted this in his assessments, but I don't see evidence that the significance registered with Allied planners. The reduction from 5.2 meters to 4.8 meters of usable width doesn't sound dramatic until you calculate the clearance margins. A Sherman at 2.62 meters wide now had only 1.09 meters on each side, 54.5 centimeters. That's barely enough clearance for a commander to traverse his turret without worrying about striking a vehicle passing in the opposite direction. At night, in rain, under fire, the road would become impassable to two-way traffic. And if the road only supported one-way movement, vehicles traveling south, ambulances evacuating wounded, empty supply trucks returning to reload would have to wait for gaps in the northbound flow. The logistics spiraled downward from there. What strikes me most about Van der Veer's memo is its tone. Respectfully request alternate routes. He wasn't arguing or demanding. He was making a professional assessment and politely suggesting that someone needed to reconsider the plan. The response, noted, no alternatives available, is equally revealing. It's not that the engineers disagreed with Van der Veer's assessment. They acknowledged his concerns, noted them in the record, and then proceeded anyway because alternatives didn't exist. Market Garden required this specific route because the operational concept demanded rapid advance to seize specific bridges before German forces could destroy them. There wasn't time to search for better roads or build new infrastructure. The highway existed, therefore the highway would be used. Geography isn't negotiable. Physics isn't aspirational. A 5.2-meter road cannot be wished into a 10-meter highway because the operation requires more width. Van der Veer understood this. The engineers understood this. But understanding didn't change the plan. And on the 17th of September, 20,000 vehicles began moving onto a road that couldn't support them. Chapter 4. Student's Diary. The 17th of September, 1944, 1300 hours, give or take 5 minutes. A farmhouse attic in Oosterbeek, a small Dutch town west of Arnhem, where the houses had steep tile roofs and small windows that looked out over fields that had been plowed for centuries. Arie Bestebruce was 19 years old, a student before the occupation, unemployed during it, and now a member of the Dutch underground resistance, though his contribution to that resistance consisted mostly of listening to BBC broadcasts and passing along rumors. He wasn't a fighter. He didn't have a weapon. When the war came to his town that afternoon, he climbed into the attic with his diary and a pair of binoculars his father used for bird watching. His mother was in the kitchen below, making bread. His father was in the cellar, hiding the family's valuables behind a false wall he'd constructed in 1943 when deportations began. They weren't Jewish, but the Germans had taken people for other reasons too: forced labor, reprisals, random cruelty. You kept your valuables hidden and your head down. Until the morning of the 17th, when the sky filled with airplanes. Bestebruce's diary entry, written in Dutch with some words underlined or circled for emphasis, begins with an observation about sound. The sound is like sheets tearing. That's what my mother said. I counted 114 planes before I lost count. White flowers opening in the sky. Parachutes. The milk bottles on the shelf are rattling. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was describing what he sensed. The sound of massed aircraft formations isn't like anything else. It's too loud to be individual engines, too structured to be thunder. It vibrates in your chest and makes solid objects hum with sympathetic resonance. The milk bottles weren't a metaphor. They actually rattled on the kitchen shelf because the walls of the farmhouse were vibrating from the engine noise of hundreds of C-47 transport aircraft flying overhead at low altitude. The white flowers weren't poetry either. That's exactly what parachute canopies look like from the ground when they first deploy. White, round, blooming against the blue sky. He counted to 114 before losing track, which suggests he was trying to bring order to chaos through enumeration. That's a very human impulse. By 1400 hours, the situation had shifted from spectacle to danger. Bestebruce could see paratroopers landing in fields roughly a mile north of his position, could see the parachutes collapsing as men gathered their gear and began moving. He couldn't see whether they were organizing into units or what their objectives were. He was watching tiny figures at extreme distance, more like watching insects than watching soldiers. But he could hear gunfire starting, sporadic at first, then building into sustained bursts. Machine guns, probably, though he had no military training and couldn't distinguish weapon types by sound. What he could distinguish was direction, and the gunfire was coming from multiple directions, not just one. That meant German forces were reacting, moving to engage the paratroopers. His diary records a conversation with his mother through the attic floor. She asked if he could see British soldiers. He told her yes, they were landing everywhere. She asked if they were coming to the house. He didn't know. The uncertainty in those 3 sentences captures the civilian experience of combat. You see pieces of events but don't understand their meaning, don't know whether you're safe or in danger, can't predict what happens next. The first British soldiers arrived at the WW2 farmhouse at approximately 1900 hours. 3 men carrying equipment that clanked and rifles that looked enormous up close. They spoke English that none of the family understood well, though WW2's father had learned some English in school before the war and could communicate in broken phrases. The soldiers wanted water. They'd been carrying heavy loads in warm September weather and were desperately thirsty. The family gave them water from the kitchen pump, and the soldiers drank it without asking if it was safe. One of them pulled out a map, unfolded it on the kitchen table, and asked questions about German positions. Where were the Germans? How many? Which roads had checkpoints? WW2's father tried to answer but didn't know. The family had stayed inside during the occupation as much as possible. They knew there were Germans in Arnhem, knew there were checkpoints on some roads, but they couldn't provide the tactical intelligence the soldiers needed. The soldiers seemed disappointed but not surprised. They thanked the family, refilled their canteens, and moved on. The entire interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes. It was the only time WW2 would speak to British soldiers while they were still confident of victory. The next 2 days dissolved into a chaos that WW2 struggled to describe even as events happened. His entries become more fragmented, less concerned with narrative and more focused on immediate survival. September 18th, the family evacuated after a shell hit the house 2 doors down, killing the Decker family, all 4 of them, instantly. The streets were crowded with other civilians carrying suitcases and bundles, trying to move south away from the fighting. But the roads were also full of British troops moving north toward Arnhem. The 2 flows, civilian refugees and military traffic, intersected awkwardly, everyone trying to use the same narrow streets. Dutch SS men, collaborators in German uniform, were checking papers at some intersections. WW2's father had false papers prepared, identifying him as too old for labor service, but the inspection was perfunctory. The Dutch SS were more interested in catching underground fighters than harassing obviously civilian families. They waved the WW2's through. By nightfall on the 18th, the family was hiding in the basement of a church, sleeping on pews that had been moved down into the crypt. 27 people crowded into a space designed for storage. No one spoke above a whisper. September 19th and 20th blend together in WW2's account. He lost track of time in the basement, couldn't tell day from night except when someone went upstairs and reported back. The fighting intensified. He could hear it through the stone walls. Mortar fire, which made a hollow crump sound, followed by the crash of impact. Artillery, which was louder and deeper, and small arms fire that sometimes sounded like firecrackers and sometimes like tearing cloth, depending on distance. The church shook. Plaster dust sifted down from the ceiling. A woman in the basement was crying constantly, not loud theatrical sobs, but a quiet, continuous weeping that set everyone's nerves on edge. On the 20th, a British soldier appeared in the basement. WW2 doesn't explain how he got there or what unit he belonged to, and stayed for approximately 3 hours, resting in a corner with his rifle across his lap. He didn't speak to anyone. When he left, WW2 noticed he'd left a ration tin behind. Meat and vegetables, Type C, one of the small brown tins that British soldiers carried. The family ate it that night, cold, sharing it among 8 people. It was the first food they'd had in 20 hours. The most striking detail in Beste Breertje's diary, the one that affects me most when I read it, is his entry from September 20th or 21st. The date is uncertain because he'd stopped tracking days precisely. He writes, "I saw British soldiers running past the church, going south, away from Arnhem. Not marching, running. That's when I knew." He doesn't elaborate on what he knew, doesn't spell it out, but the implication is clear. British forces were withdrawing, the operation was failing, liberation wasn't coming. On September 16th, Beste Breertje had written about seeing his cousins in Amsterdam by next week, imagining the Allied advance rolling north and liberating the rest of the Netherlands in a matter of days. That optimism lasted exactly 4 days. By the 20th, he was watching British soldiers retreat past his hiding place, and he understood that his town would remain under German occupation, that the violence he'd witnessed was pointless, that nothing had changed except now there were bodies in the streets and houses were burning. There's a source conflict embedded in Beste Breertje's account that I find compelling precisely because it reveals the gap between military records and civilian experience. British operational maps from September 20th show the 1st Airborne Division perimeter still forming around Oosterbeek, suggesting organized defensive positions and controlled withdrawal. Beste Breertje, watching from his basement hiding spot, saw disorganized soldiers running south on the 20th, well before official British accounts acknowledged that the perimeter was collapsing. He wasn't seeing a tactical withdrawal to prepared positions. He was seeing defeat before commanders admitted defeat existed. Civilians often see these things first because they don't have the institutional investment in maintaining narrative coherence. A soldier retreating in good order looks, from street level, like a soldier running away. Beste Breertje didn't have enough military knowledge to distinguish between the two, but he had enough human instinct to recognize fear when he saw it. The British soldiers running past the church were afraid. So was he. The diary ends abruptly on September 25th with a 1-sentence entry. The British are gone. No elaboration, no emotional processing, just a statement of fact. By that point, Beste Breertje and his family were still in the basement, would remain there for another week before cautiously emerging to find their house partially destroyed by shelling and their neighborhood looking like a junkyard of abandoned military equipment. The Decker family, their neighbors, were still buried in the rubble 2 houses down. German soldiers reoccupied Oosterbeek on September 26th and began rounding up military-aged Dutch men for labor details. Beste Breertje went into deeper hiding, moving to a relative's farm outside town, where he stayed until the actual liberation came in April 1945. 7 months later, his diary survived because he buried it in a tobacco tin in the church basement. He retrieved it in 1946 and donated it to the Dutch War Documentation Institute in 1952, where researchers found it decades later. It's a thin notebook, maybe 40 pages, filled with handwriting that gets messier as the entries progress. I keep coming back to his description of the milk bottles rattling, that domestic detail in the moment before his world ended. Chapter 5. Bitterich's Afternoon. The 17th of September, 1944, 1300 hours and 4 minutes. A headquarters building in Doetinchem, Netherlands, approximately 25 miles from Arnhem, where SS Obergruppenführer Wilhelm Bitterich commanded the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. His office was in a commandeered Dutch municipal building, requisitioned in July when his corps had withdrawn from France to refit. The room wasn't impressive. Civil service furniture, maps pinned to walls that still had government posters from 1940, windows that looked out onto a street where local Dutch residents walked past German soldiers with careful avoidance of eye contact. Bitterich was at his desk when the telephone rang. The War Diary of 2nd SS Panzer Corps records the next 4 minutes with bureaucratic precision. 1300 hours, multiple reports enemy parachute landings, Arnhem Nijmegen area. 1304 hours, Corps order issued, 9th SS Panzer Division to Arnhem, 10th SS Panzer Division to Nijmegen, immediate effect. 4 minutes from initial report to corps-level movement order. No recorded discussion, no request for confirmation, no delay for situation assessment, just movement. Bittrich wasn't a man given to panic or hesitation, traits that served him well in September 1944, when the entire German front in Western Europe was dissolving. He'd commanded panzer forces in Russia, France, and now the Netherlands, had learned that speed of decision-making mattered more than perfection of decision-making, especially when facing enemies with superior resources. The Allied superiority in men, tanks, and aircraft meant that German commanders couldn't win through firepower. They had to win through tempo, reacting faster than Allied planners anticipated, disrupting operations before they could develop momentum. When the reports came in about Allied paratroopers landing near Arnhem, Bittrich didn't waste time trying to determine exact numbers or verify the reports through multiple channels. He assumed the reports were true, made the obvious inference. This was a major airborne operation targeting the bridges over the Rhine and Waal rivers, and issued movement orders immediately. His 2 divisions weren't at full strength, but they were mobile and they were close. That was enough. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, commanded by SS Oberfuhrer Walter Harzer, received Bittrich's movement order at 13:15 hours, 11 minutes after the Corps diary recorded the decision. Harzer's post-war interrogation, document ETHINT 21, from the European Theatre Historical Interrogations Collection, provides his recollection of that afternoon. He was at his division headquarters when a staff officer handed him the telephone. Bittrich's order was verbal and direct. Enemy airborne forces landing at Arnhem. Move all available forces to engage. No delay. Harzer began issuing company-level orders immediately, not waiting to assemble his staff for a formal orders group. Company commanders would receive their instructions and begin moving. The operational plan would develop as the situation clarified. This was improvisation operating at divisional scale, the kind of decentralized command that German military culture enabled, but that often baffled Allied officers who expected written orders with detailed annexes and confirmation procedures. By 14:30 hours, 90 minutes after the initial report reached Bittrich, the first German reconnaissance elements were moving toward Arnhem. The War Diary of the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion records departure time and composition. 2 companies mounted in trucks, approximately 200 men with machine guns and light anti-tank weapons. They weren't a combat formation designed to stop an airborne assault. They were a probe designed to locate enemy forces and report back. But their mere presence on the roads between Oosterbeek and Arnhem meant that British paratroopers advancing toward their objectives would encounter German resistance hours earlier than Allied planners had anticipated. The operational timeline assumed 12 to 24 hours before German forces could react in strength. Harzer's reconnaissance elements cut that timeline to 4 hours. When Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion reached Arnhem Bridge that evening, they found it undefended. If they'd arrived 2 hours later, German infantry would already have been in position. The margin was that thin. Bittrich's decision-making speed becomes even more striking when you compare it to Allied command procedures. British military doctrine required written confirmatory orders for major movements, a system designed to prevent confusion and ensure that subordinate commanders understood their missions clearly. The trade-off was time. Drafting an order, typing it, distributing copies, and waiting for acknowledgement could easily consume 2 to 4 hours. German SS units operated under a different system. Korpsbefehl, corps orders, were issued verbally, often over telephone lines, and company-level commanders were authorized to interpret those orders independently based on local conditions. There was no requirement for confirmation or clarification unless a subordinate commander had specific questions. The system assumed competence and initiative at all levels, which worked when you had professional soldiers who'd been fighting for 4 years and understood operational concepts intuitively. The downside was potential for misunderstanding, but Bittrich accepted that risk in exchange for reduced decision latency. His corps could react 60 to 120 minutes faster than equivalent British formations. And in the chaos of September 1944, that speed differential was decisive. There's a detail in Bittrich's response that I find particularly significant, though it's mentioned only in post-war sources and isn't in the immediate contemporary records. In August 1944, while his corps was refitting after withdrawing from France, Bittrich had conducted a staff exercise, a theoretical war game that examined how his units would respond to an Allied airborne assault on Arnhem. It was a standard training exercise, the kind that professional military staffs conducted routinely to keep officers sharp. The scenario: Allied forces attempt to seize the Arnhem bridges using airborne troops, with ground forces advancing from the south. German forces must respond with limited assets. The exercise had produced a response plan: 9th SS Panzer Division to Arnhem, 10th SS Panzer Division to Nijmegen, reconnaissance elements forward immediately, combat formations to follow. When the actual Allied assault came on September 17th, Bittrich issued almost exactly the same orders he'd wargamed a month earlier. He didn't have to invent a response. He activated a pre-planned template. What unsettles me, reading through the German records, is the calmness of the documentation. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps War Diary doesn't use exclamation points or capital letters for emphasis. There's no sense of emergency in the prose, no indication that the staff was surprised or alarmed. The entries read like routine administrative business. 1300 hours, reports received. 1304 hours, orders issued. The measured tone suggests either exceptional discipline or a command culture where crisis was normalized. Probably both. By September 1944, German commanders on the Western Front had been dealing with existential threats for months. Allied breakthrough in Normandy, encirclement at Falaise, collapse of Army Group B, retreat across France. The Wehrmacht had been in crisis mode continuously since July. An Allied airborne assault at Arnhem was serious, but not unprecedented. It was another problem to solve, and Bittrich solved it with the same methodical efficiency he'd applied to every other crisis that summer. The telephone log fragment preserved in American archives. It's at the National Archives and Records Administration, captured German documents section. Shows that Bittrich attempted to contact Field Marshal Walter Model at Army Group B headquarters at 1600 hours on the 17th. He wanted Luftwaffe reconnaissance over Arnhem to confirm the scale of the Allied operation and identify follow-on forces. Model's staff denied the request. No aircraft available. This was the reality of the German Air Force in September 1944. Functionally non-existent in the West, incapable of providing even basic reconnaissance support. Bittrich would have to react to the Allied airborne assault without knowing its full scope, without aerial reconnaissance, without reserves, and without any reasonable expectation of reinforcement. He had 2 understrength divisions, some attached infantry, and whatever artillery he could scrounge from retreating units. Against that, the Allies had committed 10,000 paratroopers with more planned for follow-on lifts, plus an entire armored corps advancing up Highway 69. On paper, Bittrich had no chance. But paper doesn't account for speed or initiative or the willingness to act decisively on incomplete information. By the time Allied commanders at Moor Park in England were still receiving initial situation reports, Bittrich's reconnaissance troops were already in contact with British paratroopers on the ground. The comparison to modern technology company culture is almost too obvious, but I'll make it anyway because the parallel is instructive. Silicon Valley startups operate on principles of rapid iteration and decisive action with imperfect information. Move fast and break things, in the infamous phrase. Large corporations operate with approval processes, risk assessment committees, and documented decision trails. Both approaches have advantages. The startup model enables speed and adaptability. The corporate model prevents catastrophic mistakes. Bittrich's 2nd SS Panzer Corps functioned like a startup, small, motivated, operating with minimal bureaucracy, empowered to make immediate decisions. British 1st Airborne Corps functioned like an enterprise, large, hierarchical, dependent on formal procedures and written orders. In the specific circumstances of Market Garden, a rapidly evolving situation where hours mattered, the startup model won. Not because German soldiers were better than British soldiers, but because German command structure enabled faster reaction time. Bittrich issued movement orders in 4 minutes. How long did it take British commanders to adjust their plans when intelligence reports came in about German armor? Days, and by then it was too late to matter. Speed was the asymmetric advantage that partially compensated for German material weakness, and on September 17, 1944, it was enough. Chapter 6. The Drop Zone. Miscalculation. The 8th of September, 1944. An air planning conference room at Moore Park, northwest of London, where officers from 1st Airborne Corps and 38 Group Royal Air Force were hammering out the final details of Operation Market Garden's aerial insertion phase. The room smelled of tea and cigarette smoke. Everyone smoked, constantly, filling ashtrays and lighting new cigarettes from the stubs of old ones. Maps covered the tables, marked with colored grease pencil showing drop zones, flight paths, and known anti-aircraft positions. The American officers from 9th Troop Carrier Command sat on one side of the table, the British on the other, and the primary point of contention wasn't operational concept or timing, it was risk. The Americans did not want their transport aircraft making multiple passes over defended areas. Group Captain Nigel Norman, commanding 38 Group RAF, understood the American concern, but disagreed with the solution. His planning documents, filed under Air Staff Memo, reference 38/AIR/14, laid out the problem with characteristic precision. The ideal drop zones for 1st Airborne Division would be within 2 miles of Arnhem Bridge, close enough that paratroopers could reach their objective and seize it before German forces could react. But those drop zones fell within the assessed range of German anti-aircraft batteries protecting Arnhem. American transport pilots, flying vulnerable C-47 aircraft at low altitude and slow speed, would be exposed to flak for the entire duration of the drop. American doctrine insisted on single-pass drops. Fly in, drop the paratroopers, fly out, minimize exposure time. That doctrine worked in Normandy, where drop zones had been deliberately chosen in areas with light defenses. It didn't work at Arnhem, where the only suitable landing areas within 2 miles of the bridge were also within German flak range. The compromise, and I use that word deliberately because compromises in military planning often produce disasters, was to move the drop zones west, away from Arnhem, beyond the estimated range of German anti-aircraft guns. The new drop zones would be 6 to 8 miles from the bridge, requires paratroopers to march that distance on foot while carrying equipment, weapons, and ammunition. Norman protested in writing. His September 8 memo calculates the time lost to ground movement, paratroopers landing at 1400 hours, organizing into formations by 1500 hours, beginning march by 1530 hours, reaching Arnhem Bridge perimeter by 1830 hours at earliest. 3 hours minimum, probably more. 3 hours during which German forces could react, reinforce the bridge, or demolish it. The operational concept of Market Garden depended on speed and surprise. Seize the bridges before the Germans could respond. Moving the drop zones 8 miles away surrendered that advantage. Norman wrote, "Concur reluctantly," 2 words that encapsulate the bureaucratic reality of inter-service operations. You can know a plan is wrong and still implement it, because alternatives don't exist within the political constraints of coalition warfare. The assessment of German anti-aircraft strength around Arnhem was based on photographic reconnaissance and signals intelligence, both of which indicated moderate flak concentrations. Moderate in air planning terms meant enough guns to be dangerous, but not enough to guarantee high losses. The specific estimate was 12 to 15 anti-aircraft batteries of mixed calibers, primarily 88mm guns with a maximum effective range of 8,000 meters altitude. American transport aircraft would fly at approximately 500 meters altitude during the drop, well within engagement range. British Air Staff calculated probable losses at 10 to 15% if drop zones were placed close to Arnhem. 10 to 15% was deemed unacceptable. The decision to move drop zones farther away reduced estimated losses to 3 to 5%. But the calculation only considered aircraft losses. It didn't factor in what those 3 hours of ground march would cost in terms of operational surprise and tactical advantage. The reality of German anti-aircraft strength around Arnhem, documented only after the battle when captured records could be analyzed, was far less than Allied planners feared. The city had 8 operational anti-aircraft guns on September 17th, 3 88mm heavy flak, 5 20mm light flak, 8 guns total. The reason Allied intelligence overestimated German strength was structural. Photographic reconnaissance could identify gun emplacements, but couldn't determine if they were manned and operational. An empty gun pit looked the same as an active battery from 20,000 feet altitude. Signals intelligence detected anti-aircraft units in the general area, but couldn't pinpoint their exact locations or confirm their status. So Allied planners erred on the side of caution, assumed that identified positions were operational, and designed flight paths accordingly. 3 hours of ground march time was the price paid for protecting transport aircraft from a threat that turned out to be minimal. What complicates this story further is the glider operations on September 17th. Gliders, unlike parachute drops, could land closer to objectives because they didn't require multiple passes. The tug aircraft released the glider at altitude, then turned away, while the glider made a silent approach to landing. 1st Airborne Division's headquarters element, including Major General Roy Urquhart, landed by glider approximately 3 miles from Arnhem Bridge, well inside the high flak risk zone that had been used to justify pushing parachute drop zones farther away. Urquhart's glider landed safely. So did most of the others. German anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and ineffective. The glider landings proved that the risk assessment was wrong, but by that point, the main parachute force was already landing 8 miles away. The operational plan had been frozen. There was no mechanism to adjust mid-execution and say, the flak isn't as bad as we thought. Let's bring the second lift in closer. Doctrine, once committed to execution, couldn't be modified in real time. Norman's memo includes a technical detail that becomes significant later: the difference between 88mm heavy flak and 20mm light flak. The 88 was a serious threat to aircraft. It could reach 26,000 feet and was radar-guided in some installations, allowing accurate fire even through clouds. The 20mm guns were primarily designed for low-altitude defense and relied on optical aiming. Against fast-moving aircraft, they were dangerous. Against slow transport aircraft flying predictable patterns, they could be devastating, but only if the aircraft flew within range, approximately 2 miles. The American assessment focused on the 88s, which had long range and could threaten the entire flight path. The British assessment focused on the 20s, which were short range but numerous. Different threat priorities produced different conclusions about acceptable risk, and those conclusions shaped the drop zone placement that shaped the entire operation. When I examine the flight paths actually flown on September 17th, the conservatism of the planning becomes even more apparent. 38 Group RAF routed the transport formations on a wide arc around Arnhem, approaching the drop zones from the west to avoid even the theoretical engagement envelope of German heavy flak. The flight path added approximately 12 minutes to the total mission time compared to a direct approach. And those 12 minutes represent the accumulated caution of air planners who'd seen too many aircraft shot down in previous operations. Nobody wanted to be the officer who approved flight paths that got paratroopers killed before they even exited the aircraft. So they built in safety margins, then added more safety margins, until the final plan was so conservative that it forfeited operational advantage in exchange for aircrew protection. Both goals, protecting aircraft, and achieving tactical surprise were legitimate. They were also mutually exclusive, and in September 1944, air safety won the argument. The second lift, scheduled for September 18th, was delayed by weather. Fog over English airfields prevented takeoff until mid-morning, and by the time the weather cleared enough for flight operations, the window for morning departure had passed. The Polish Parachute Brigade, assigned to drop south of the Rhine near Arnhem, didn't arrive until afternoon. By that time, German forces had surrounded the British positions, and the drop zones were under direct fire. The delay wasn't anyone's fault. September weather in Northern Europe is unpredictable, and you can't fly transport formations through fog. But it compounded the problems created by the distant drop zones. If the Polish brigade had landed on schedule on the 17th, they might have reinforced Frost's battalion at the bridge. Instead, they landed a day late, miles from where they were needed, into a tactical situation that had already collapsed. Weather and planning combined to produce disaster, and to me, the most frustrating aspect is that all of these problems were foreseeable and foreseen. Norman's memo proves that someone understood the risks. The memo was filed, acknowledged, and ignored. The choice to prioritize aircraft safety over tactical advantage reflects a deeper institutional tension in coalition warfare, whose losses are acceptable. American 9th Troop Carrier Command was providing the aircraft and crews. British 1st Airborne Division was providing the paratroopers. If German flak shot down 15 American transport aircraft, the Americans would absorb those losses while the British achieved their objective. From an American perspective, that looked like British commanders spending American lives for British goals. The Americans said no, we won't accept those losses, and they had the leverage to enforce that refusal, because without American transport aircraft, there was no market garden. So the British accepted the compromise. Drop zones farther away, longer march time, reduced chance of success. Better that than no operation at all. But compromise in military operations doesn't split the difference between two good options. It produces a third option that's worse than either original proposal. Drop zones 8 miles from the objective satisfied no one's operational requirements, but survived committee review because all parties could claim they'd made concessions. 3 hours of march time, 8 miles of Dutch countryside. That was the distance between operational concept and operational reality. And on September 17, 1944, 1st Airborne Division began walking that gap. Chapter 7. Frost's Race. The 17th of September 1944, 1500 hours precisely, Drop Zone X, approximately 8 miles west of Arnhem, where the ground was soft heathland interspersed with patches of forest and the air still smelled of parachute silk and crushed vegetation. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost stood near a collapsed parachute, watching his battalion assemble with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. Sicily, North Africa, training jumps across England. 2nd Parachute Battalion, roughly 643 men, give or take a dozen, who'd landed in trees or twisted ankles on impact. Not the 750 the battalion was supposed to field at full strength, but close enough. Frost wasn't waiting for stragglers. The battalion war diary records his directive in clipped military prose. 1500 hours, battalion moving via Lion route. Lead company reported light opposition Oosterbeek. Colonel Frost directive, speed over security, no halts for stragglers. Someone with a pencil had underlined no halts twice, pressing hard enough that the graphite made an indentation in the paper beneath. Speed over security. That wasn't standard doctrine, but standard doctrine assumed you had time to consolidate, establish communications, coordinate with adjacent units. Frost didn't have time. The operational plan gave him 4 hours to reach Arnhem Bridge before German reinforcements could arrive in strength. Lion Route was the code name for the southern approach road into Arnhem, running along the River Rhine through the town of Oosterbeek. It wasn't the most direct route. That would have been the main highway from the drop zones straight east, but it was the route that British planners assessed as least likely to be heavily defended. The logic was sound. German forces would expect an attack along the main roads and position their defenses accordingly. A battalion moving along the river route might slip through the defensive coverage and reach the bridge before the Germans realized what was happening. That was the theory. The practice involved 600 men moving in company columns along narrow roads through Dutch residential neighborhoods where civilians stood in doorways watching British soldiers jog past like spectators at a peculiar race. Some waved, most just stared. The war had been distant for them until this afternoon, something that happened in newspapers and BBC broadcasts. Now it was in their streets, and they didn't know whether to be terrified or hopeful. By 1730 hours, 2.5 hours after landing, 90 minutes into the march, the lead elements of 2nd Battalion reached the outskirts of Oosterbeek proper. The company log for A Company records a brief firefight. German reconnaissance patrol, approximately 12 men with a single vehicle, engaged at close range in a residential street. The fight lasted 12 minutes according to the log, though someone has written in the margin, felt longer. 12 minutes is an eternity when you're standing in the open, exchanging fire with an enemy you can barely see through the smoke and confusion. The Germans withdrew, leaving 1 dead and the vehicle burning. A Company had 2 casualties, both wounded, neither seriously enough to prevent movement. They were patched up by the company medic and told to keep walking. Frost directive: no halts for stragglers. The wounded could keep up or they couldn't, but the column wasn't stopping. That sounds harsh written down decades later in peacetime, but it was the arithmetic of the situation. Every minute spent halted was a minute German forces could use to organize defenses at the bridge. Frost was racing against time, not terrain. The railway bridge at Oosterbeek appeared through the trees at approximately 1900 hours, a black steel structure spanning the Rhine with the water dark and fast-moving below. Captain Eric Mackay's diary. He commanded 1st Parachute Squadron Royal Engineers attached to Frost's battalion. Describes approaching the bridge and seeing immediately that something was wrong. The center span was missing, not damaged, not partially collapsed, but completely gone, leaving a gap of perhaps 40 meters where the steel superstructure had been dropped into the river. German demolitions, probably executed during their retreat from France weeks earlier. The bridge was unusable. Mackay's engineers could have repaired it, given time and equipment. But time was exactly what they didn't have, and their equipment consisted of hand tools and small quantities of explosives, not bridge-building materials. The railway bridge was written off. The battalion would continue to the road bridge, the primary objective, hoping it was still intact. 1900 hours. The light was starting to fade, not full darkness yet, but that long European twilight where visibility becomes uncertain and shadows could be enemy soldiers or could be bushes. A company, leading the battalion column, reached the northern approach to Arnhem Road Bridge. The bridge was intact. That single fact, intact superstructure, roadway undamaged, no demolition charges visible, was the only piece of good news Frost would receive that day. The northern end of the bridge terminated in an elevated ramp approximately 12 meters above ground level, designed to allow ship traffic to pass underneath. The ramp provided commanding fields of fire in all directions, which was tactically advantageous for whoever controlled it. A company secured the buildings adjacent to the ramp, established firing positions, and waited for the rest of the battalion to arrive. By 2000 hours, Frost had approximately 600 men consolidated in a rough perimeter around the northern bridge approach. Not 643. Some had been left behind as casualties during the march. Others had gotten lost in the maze of Arnhem streets. A few had been detailed off for other tasks. 600 was the working number. The 2nd Battalion had reached its objective in 4 hours and 45 minutes from landing, faster than the operational plan anticipated. But they'd reached it alone. The rest of 1st Parachute Brigade, 1st Battalion, and 3rd Battalion were supposed to be taking parallel routes into Arnhem, converging on the bridge from different directions to overwhelm any German defenders. Those battalions weren't there. Frost couldn't communicate with them because his radios weren't working. The same number 22 wireless set problems that would plague the entire operation. He couldn't communicate with divisional headquarters to request orders or report his position. He was isolated at the bridge with 600 men, 2 6-pounder anti-tank guns that had been manhandled onto the elevated ramp, and 17 Piat anti-tank launchers distributed among the rifle companies. Against that, he had no intelligence about German strength or intentions, no idea when reinforcements would arrive, and no orders beyond hold the bridge. So that's what he prepared to do. 2040 hours, 40 minutes after Frost's battalion secured the bridge, the first German reaction arrived. The war diary records it clinically. German column approaching from south, approximately 20 vehicles. The actual German unit log, recovered from 9th SS Panzer Division archives after the war, identifies the unit as 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion, 12 half-tracks and 4 armored cars, moving north to investigate reports of British paratroopers in Arnhem. The Reconnaissance Battalion wasn't expecting to find British forces already holding the bridge. Their intelligence suggested the paratroopers had landed miles away and wouldn't reach Arnhem until the next day. Finding the bridge held was a shock, and shock produces hesitation. The German column slowed, trying to assess the situation, and in that moment of hesitation, Frost's men opened fire. The bridge approach ramp provided perfect enfilade fire positions. The Germans were caught on the elevated roadway with nowhere to take cover. Piat launchers fired at near point-blank range. The 6-pounder guns engaged the armored cars with armor-piercing rounds. The engagement lasted perhaps 15 minutes before the surviving German vehicles reversed course and withdrew south across the bridge, leaving burning wrecks behind. There's a source conflict here worth examining because it illustrates how memory and official records diverge under stress. Frost's post-war memoir claims the German column included at least 20 vehicles, suggesting a significant force. The captured German unit log lists 16 vehicles total, 12 half-tracks and 4 armored cars. Both sources agree that the British presence was unexpected and that German losses were severe. The unit log records 3 half-tracks and 1 armored car destroyed, plus casualties of 19 killed and 27 wounded. The discrepancy in vehicle count doesn't matter tactically, but it matters historiographically because it shows how combat participants overestimate enemy strength. 20 vehicles versus 16 vehicles is a 25% inflation, not egregious, but consistent with the tendency of soldiers under fire to see threats as larger than they are. What both sources agree on is the shock of the encounter. The Germans weren't prepared for the bridge to be defended, and Frost's battalion wasn't prepared for German armor to appear so quickly. Both sides were improvising. The ammunition expenditure from that first engagement set a pattern that would define the next 4 days. Frost's battalion had landed with standard combat loads. Each rifleman carried 50 rounds of .303 caliber ammunition. Each Bren gun crew had 6 magazines. Each Piat launcher had 3 bombs. Those were the loads men could reasonably carry during a parachute drop and 8-mile march. Resupply was supposed to come from follow-on lifts and supply drops, but resupply depended on the rest of the division linking up at the bridge. In that first 15-minute engagement, the battalion expended approximately 1,200 rounds of rifle ammunition, 4 Piat bombs, and 11 6-pounder armor-piercing rounds. Not catastrophic, but not trivial either. At that rate of consumption, the battalion had ammunition for perhaps 36 hours of sustained combat. The operational plan called for them to hold for 48 hours, until 30th Corps arrived from the south. The math was tight. What haunts me when I read through 2nd Battalion's war diary is the 40-minute gap that appears in the timeline. Frost's lead elements reached the bridge at 2000 hours. The 1st German column attempted to cross at 2040 hours. Where were the other British battalions? 1st and 3rd Battalions had landed at the same time as 2nd Battalion, had begun their approach marches at roughly the same time, had similar distances to cover. If all 3 battalions had moved at Frost's pace, speed over security, no halts for stragglers, they would have converged on the bridge between 2000 and 2100 hours. 3 battalions, roughly 1,800 men, with coordinated fields of fire and mutually supporting positions. That force could have held the bridge perimeter indefinitely, or at least long enough for 30th Corps to arrive. Instead, Frost was alone at the bridge, and the other battalions were somewhere in Arnhem streets, delayed by German resistance or confusion, or the simple friction of movement through urban terrain. The 40-minute window between Frost arriving and the Germans reacting was the window for reinforcement. It closed without being used. The night of September 17th to 18th brought sporadic German probing attacks, none in serious strength, all repulsed by British small arms fire. Frost established a rotation system. 1 company on watch, 2 companies resting, rotating every 4 hours. The buildings around the bridge approach provided shelter, though shelter is relative when the structures are brick row houses that offer concealment, but not cover against anything heavier than small arms fire. The men slept in shifts on floors, using their equipment as pillows, weapons within arm's reach. Some civilians remained in the buildings, elderly residents who couldn't or wouldn't evacuate, and the British soldiers shared their rations with them because the alternative was watching Dutch civilians starve while British troops ate. That small detail appears in multiple accounts. British paratroopers giving away food they would desperately need themselves in the days ahead. It wasn't official policy. It was human decency operating in circumstances where decency was irrational. By dawn on September 18th, Frost's tactical situation was clear. He held the north end of Arnhem Bridge with approximately 600 men, adequate ammunition for at least 1 more day, no communications with higher headquarters, and no knowledge of when relief would arrive. The southern end of the bridge was held by German forces. He could see them establishing positions in buildings across the river. The bridge itself was no man's land, a 590-meter-long killing zone that neither side could cross without catastrophic losses. Frost wasn't trying to cross. His mission was to hold the northern approach and prevent German forces from demolishing the bridge or using it to move reinforcements south. As long as he held, the bridge remained a viable objective for 30th Corps advancing from the south. The operational logic was sound. What the operational logic didn't account for was how long Frost could hold without reinforcement, without resupply, without even radio confirmation that anyone knew where he was or that his sacrifice mattered. 2nd Battalion had reached the bridge in time. The race was won. But winning the race turned out to be only the beginning of the battle, and the real question, the one that would be answered over the next 72 hours, was whether winning the race meant anything if no one else reached the finish line. Chapter 8. The Radio Silence. The 17th of September, 1944, 1745 hours. A street corner in Oosterbeek where signalman Thomas Cook sat on the ground next to his number 22 wireless set, the heavy metal case balanced on his knees while he adjusted frequency crystals with fingers that were starting to shake from a combination of adrenaline come-down and genuine fear that the equipment simply wasn't working. The set looked functional. Batteries charged, aerial extended properly, all connections tight. But when Cook pressed the transmit key and spoke into the handset, he received nothing back except static. The equipment status log he maintained, a small notebook issued to all signalers for tracking faults and repairs, shows his growing frustration in abbreviated technical notes. No contact with Brigade HQ. Crystals tested. Aerials checked. Set function normal. No transmission received. Attempting alternative frequencies. The word "no" was written in capital letters and underlined. The kind of emphasis you make when you're documenting what might later be blamed on you, and you want the record to show you did everything right. 1st Airborne Divisional signals had landed with approximately 120 number 22 wireless sets distributed among battalion and company headquarters, forward observers, and liaison teams. The number 22 was the standard British Army medium-range radio, designed for distances up to 8 miles in ideal conditions. 8 miles was exactly the distance between the drop zones and divisional headquarters, which should have made communications straightforward. By 1800 hours on the 17th, fewer than 30% of those sets were achieving contact with higher headquarters. The rest were like cooks, transmitting into void, receiving only static, functionally useless. The Signals After-Action Report, compiled weeks later when survivors could be interviewed, blamed adverse terrain and building density for the radio failures. The phrase adverse terrain was doing a lot of work in that assessment. What they meant was that Arnhem's urban environment and surrounding forests were interfering with radio propagation in ways that peacetime testing in England hadn't predicted. The number 22 operated on frequencies between 4.2 and 7.6 MHz, a range that required either line of sight or ground wave propagation to function reliably. Line of sight was impossible in forested areas or urban zones with multi-story buildings. Ground wave propagation worked over flat, open terrain, but degraded rapidly when signals had to pass through dense materials like brick walls or tree cover. Arnhem was the worst possible environment for the number 22. A town built primarily of brick row houses interspersed with forests, sitting in low-lying terrain where buildings and vegetation created multiple obstacles to signal propagation. The engineers who designed the number 22 understood these limitations. VHF propagation physics weren't mysterious, but the operational planners either didn't understand or chose to ignore them. The radios had worked adequately in Normandy, where drop zones were in open farmland. They failed catastrophically at Arnhem, where every transmission had to punch through miles of forest and masonry. 1930 hours, September 17th. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding 1st Airborne Division, departed his headquarters in a jeep with a small staff group to locate 1st Parachute Brigade headquarters. The decision to leave divisional headquarters wasn't reckless. It was the logical response to complete communications failure. Urquhart couldn't command his division without knowing where his units were or what they were doing, and since radios weren't working, he had to go physically locate his subordinate commanders and issue orders face-to-face. His diary records the departure time and destination, but doesn't record what happened next. His jeep group drove into Arnhem's outskirts, encountered German forces, got separated from the rest of the division, and spent the next 24 hours isolated and unreachable. The division commander disappeared because his radios didn't work, and he tried to solve that problem by driving into contested territory without adequate escort. For 24 hours, 1st Airborne Division fought without its commanding general, and no one at higher headquarters knew whether Urquhart was dead, captured, or simply lost. The alternative communication method, relay through RAF aircraft, was attempted on September 18th at 0800 hours. The signals log shows the attempt. Divisional headquarters transmitted messages via a Royal Air Force liaison officer flying overhead in a light aircraft equipped with both ground and air frequency radios. The concept was that the aircraft would orbit over Arnhem, receive transmissions from ground forces on the number 22 frequency, then relay those messages to RAF bases in England on aircraft frequencies, which would then pass the information to 1st Airborne Corps headquarters via landline. It was a cumbersome system, but it was supposed to work. The pilot reported receiving British transmissions clearly. He could hear ground stations calling divisional headquarters. But when he tried to relay messages back down, the ground stations couldn't hear him. One-way communication only. The ground forces were broadcasting into void, not knowing whether anyone was listening. Meanwhile, higher headquarters in England had no situation reports, no casualty figures, no understanding of what was happening at Arnhem, except that something had clearly gone wrong. What makes me angry reading through these signals logs is that the communication failures weren't inevitable. There was an alternative. The American SCR-300 VHF radio set, operating on frequencies between 40 and 48 MHz. Those frequencies propagated more reliably through urban environments and required less power for equivalent range. The American Airborne divisions at Nijmegen and Eindhoven had SCR-300s and maintained reliable communications throughout the operation. 1st Airborne Division had requested SCR-300s during the planning phase, but was denied due to supply shortages. Britain and the United States used incompatible radio systems, different frequencies, different components, no parts interchangeability. Giving British units American radios would have required training signalers on unfamiliar equipment and stockpiling spare parts for maintenance. The signals branch decided it was simpler to stick with British equipment that everyone knew how to use. That decision looked reasonable in August during planning conferences in England. By September 18th in Arnhem, when divisional headquarters had lost contact with every subordinate unit, the decision looked criminally negligent. There's a detail buried in the German communications intercepts that compounds the irony. German forces monitoring British radio transmissions on September 18th reported hearing 1st Airborne Division signals clearly. The Germans were receiving British transmissions that British units couldn't receive from each other. German signals intelligence officers later testified that they were confused by what they heard. British ground stations repeatedly calling for artillery support or reporting positions, with no response from higher headquarters. The Germans initially thought it was a deception plan, deliberate false transmissions designed to mislead German commanders about British intentions. It took several hours before German intelligence concluded that the British genuinely couldn't communicate with each other and that the transmissions represented operational confusion rather than tactical deception. The Germans had better intelligence about 1st Airborne Division's situation than 1st Airborne Corps headquarters in England did, purely because German radio equipment could receive signals that British equipment couldn't. On September 19th, out of desperation, British signalers began using captured German radios. Cook's diary records finding a German field radio in an abandoned vehicle, testing it, and discovering that it worked perfectly. Clear transmission, solid reception, exactly what the number 22 sets were supposed to provide, but didn't. The problem was that using captured German radios meant operating on German frequencies, which required knowing German radio protocols and encryption systems. The signalers couldn't communicate with British headquarters using German equipment, but they could communicate with other British units that also had captured German radios. It was a partial solution that demonstrated the number 22 sets were the problem, not the environment or user error. If German radios worked in Arnhem, British radios should have worked too. They didn't because they were operating on wrong frequencies for the terrain. The operational plan for Market Garden included a backup communication system, line-of-sight visual signals using colored smoke grenades and signal lamps. When radios failed, units were supposed to fall back on smoke signals or Morse code transmitted via shuttered lamps. The problem with visual signals is that they require clear lines of sight and someone watching for them. In forested terrain or urban areas, neither condition applied. A unit could fire colored smoke grenades all day and never be seen by anyone who mattered. Signal lamps were useless in daylight and suicidal at night. Flashing a light in darkness advertised your position to every German sniper within visual range. The backup systems existed on paper, but functionally didn't work in operational reality. Communication doctrine had been designed for open terrain warfare and never updated for urban or forested operations. By September 20th, 1st Airborne Division had fragmented into isolated pockets, fighting separate battles without coordination or mutual support. Frost's battalion at the bridge had no communication with divisional headquarters in Oosterbeek. Divisional headquarters couldn't communicate with brigade headquarters. Brigade couldn't reach battalions. The division was fighting blind, each unit making local decisions without knowledge of what adjacent units were doing or what higher headquarters intended. This wasn't the fog of war, the normal friction and uncertainty that affects all military operations. This was total sensory deprivation, as if someone had cut the division's spinal cord and paralyzed it from the brain down. Individual units could still fight, could still make tactical decisions, but there was no coordination, no operational coherence, no way to synchronize actions toward a unified objective. The communications catastrophe at Arnhem represents a systems failure at multiple levels. The equipment was inadequate for the environment. The planning process didn't test radios under realistic conditions. The logistics system couldn't provide alternative equipment when primary systems failed. The operational plan had no meaningful backup when communication broke down. Every level failed simultaneously, and the result was that 1st Airborne Division lost the ability to function as a division. They became a collection of battalion-sized elements fighting isolated actions. And isolated actions don't win operational objectives, no matter how bravely individual soldiers fight. I keep returning to Cook's equipment log with its desperate notations. Set function normal. No transmission received. The equipment was working exactly as designed. The design was inadequate for the mission. And no one discovered that inadequacy until 6,000 men were on the ground in enemy territory, depending on radios that couldn't reach across 8 miles of Dutch countryside. The radio silence didn't just hamper the operation, it severed the operation's nervous system and left the body convulsing without brain function. By the time anyone in England understood how complete the communications breakdown was, it was already too late to matter. Chapter 9. 30 Corps stalls. The 17th of September, 1944, 1630 hours. Captain Peter Carrington, liaison officer with the Guards Armored Division, stood in his vehicle's turret hatch watching the column ahead stretch forward along Highway 69 like a metal serpent that had stopped mid-slither. Somewhere up ahead, maybe a kilometer, maybe 2, impossible to tell because the road curved and the dust from tracked vehicles obscured everything beyond a few hundred meters, something had halted the advance. Carrington's hourly position report to 30th Corps headquarters, filed at 1630 hours, recorded the situation with professional precision. Irish Guards Lead Squadron, 2.4 kilometers south of Valkenswaard. Progress rate, 800 meters per hour. Arithmetic indicates bridge objective by 2100 hours if rate maintained. Rate will not be maintained. That last sentence was prescience or pessimism, depending on how you read it. Carrington understood enough about logistics and traffic density to know that 800 meters per hour was optimistic, not sustainable. The column wasn't moving through empty space. It was moving through physics. The advance had started well. At 1410 hours, Guards Armored Division crossed the start line at Joe's Bridge, the Belgian border crossing that marked the beginning of Operation Market Garden's ground phase. The war diary records initial progress as good, 12 kilometers in the first hour, which suggested the operational timetable might actually be achievable. The lead squadron was Irish Guards, equipped with Sherman tanks and moving with tactical caution appropriate for entering enemy-held territory. But tactical caution meant moving slowly enough to watch for ambushes, slowly enough to scan the roadside for mines, slowly enough to allow reconnaissance elements to probe forward. Tactical caution was antithetical to the operational requirement for speed. The operational plan wanted both, advance carefully but arrive quickly. Reality forced a choice. 1530 hours brought the first German resistance at Valkenswaard, a small Dutch town straddling Highway 69, approximately 5 kilometers inside the German border. The Irish Guards War Diary records the engagement. 88mm anti-tank gun positioned in concealment at a road junction, first shot destroying the lead Sherman. Column halting immediately. 47 minutes to clear the obstruction. 47 minutes during which 20,000 vehicles sat idling, consuming fuel, going nowhere. The 88 was destroyed. British doctrine was to call in artillery, suppress the position, maneuver infantry around the flanks, and eliminate the gun with combined arms tactics. The doctrine worked, but it required time. Every engagement was a time tax levied against the operational schedule, and the schedule had no slack. The plan allocated 48 hours to reach Arnhem, which meant every minute of delay accumulated as debt that could never be repaid. By 1800 hours on September 17th, the Guards had reached Eindhoven. 18 hours to travel 18 kilometers. 18 hours for 18 kilometers. Carrington's diary notes the absurdity with bitter understatement. Progress rate inadequate. The operational plan called for the Guards to reach Grave, 44 kilometers from the start line, by noon on the 18th. They were 26 kilometers short of that objective, with 18 hours already elapsed. The arithmetic was brutal. 26 kilometers remaining, 18 hours available, required average speed 1.44 kilometers per hour. Possible, but only if nothing else went wrong. September 18th at 1300 hours brought the discovery that the bridge at Sun had been demolished by retreating German forces. Bailey Bridge construction began immediately, but immediately, in military terms, meant coordinating engineers forward through the traffic jam, unloading equipment from trucks, surveying the site, and beginning assembly. The War Diary of 615 Field Squadron Royal Engineers records construction start time as 1300 hours and completion time as 0300 hours on September 19th. 14 hours to build a bridge that was supposed to take 6 hours. 14 hours during which the entire advance stopped again because there was no way forward and no way around. The traffic density mathematics that Van der Veer had tried to explain to Corps engineers manifested on September 18th as physical reality. Highway 69's 5.2-meter width became a constraint that couldn't be negotiated or overwhelmed through determination. A Sherman tank is 2.62 meters wide. With two Shermans attempting to pass each other on a 5.2-meter road, the clearance on each side was 64.5 centimeters, just over 2 feet. Tank commanders could attempt the maneuver in daylight at walking speed, with ground guides physically directing each vehicle. At night, in rain, under stress, passing was effectively impossible. The road became one-way, and once the road was one-way, every vehicle traveling south, ambulances, empty supply trucks, damaged vehicles being evacuated for repair, had to wait for gaps in northbound traffic. The gaps never materialized because northbound traffic was continuous. When I plot Carrington's position reports on a graph, and I spent considerable time doing this, cross-referencing timestamps with distances from multiple sources, the result is almost a perfect logarithmic decay curve. The advance started fast and slowed continuously as traffic density increased and German resistance accumulated. That's not a military analysis, that's physics. The road had a maximum throughput capacity, measured in vehicles per hour. And once 30th Corps exceeded that capacity, additional vehicles didn't increase speed. They decreased it by creating congestion. The British official history describes German resistance as heavier than expected, implying that combat delays explained the slow advance. German records tell a different story. The Wehrmacht defensive line south of Valkensvoorde consisted of 11 anti-tank guns and approximately 400 infantry total. Not a significant force by any standard. Carrington's reports support the German version. Most delays were caused by traffic congestion, not combat. The Sun Bridge demolition was predictable. Retreating forces always destroy bridges to slow pursuit. But the Bailey Bridge construction timeline reveals how optimistic the engineering estimates were. Major William Murray, commanding the bridge construction team, had calculated 6 hours for assembly based on peacetime training exercises conducted in England with full lighting, pre-positioned equipment, and no interference. At Sun, his engineers worked in darkness under blackout regulations, using hand tools to assemble steel components that weighed hundreds of pounds each. The structure was a Bailey H2/40 configuration. Double truss, 40-foot span, rated for 40-ton loads. Sherman tanks weighed 33.3 tons, which meant the bridge could theoretically support them, but theoretically assumed single vehicle crossings with no acceleration or braking forces. In practice, tank commanders didn't trust the load ratings and crossed one at a time at idle speed, while engineers held their breath and hoped the welds held. Each crossing took approximately 90 seconds, which meant maximum throughput of 40 tanks per hour. Guards Armored Division had 190 tanks. 4 hours and 45 minutes minimum to move just the tanks across, not counting the trucks, artillery pieces, and support vehicles. The fuel situation compounded every other problem. Sherman tanks consumed approximately 3 gallons of petrol per mile of road movement, somewhat less than cross-country, but not dramatically less because stop-and-go traffic was inefficient. From the Belgian border to Nijmegen, approximately 60 kilometers, each tank would consume roughly 110 gallons of fuel. 190 tanks times 110 gallons equals 20,900 gallons, just for the tanks. Add trucks, reconnaissance vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and the total fuel consumption for the advance was somewhere north of 300,000 gallons. The supply dumps at Borg Leopold held 280,000 gallons. The shortfall, at least 20,000 gallons, was supposed to come from captured German stocks or emergency reallocation from other armies. Neither materialized. By September 19th, Guards Armored Division was rationing fuel, prioritizing combat vehicles over support vehicles, and hoping they could reach Nijmegen before the tanks ran dry. There's a detail in the traffic analysis that strikes me as almost perfectly emblematic of the operation's fundamental contradiction. The operational plan required speed, but allocated only one road for movement. Speed requires freedom of maneuver, multiple routes, the ability to bypass obstacles. One road means every obstacle becomes a choke point. Every delay affects the entire column. Every problem cascades. Someone, I can't identify who specifically, the planning documents are signed by committees, decided that the advantage of concentrating force on a single axis outweighed the disadvantage of having no alternatives. That might have been correct if German resistance had been minimal and bridges had stayed intact. But planning an operation that required both minimal resistance and intact bridges, while assuming neither condition could be guaranteed, was optimism indistinguishable from fantasy. Carrington's reports document the collision between operational fantasy and logistical reality. The numbers don't lie. 800 meters per hour progress rate. 64 kilometers remaining to Arnhem means 80 hours to cover the distance. The operational plan allocated 48 hours. 80 hours versus 48 hours. That's the gap between plan and performance, measured in arithmetic that a child could perform, but that senior commanders apparently didn't. By the evening of September 19th, 30th Corps had reached Nijmegen but not yet crossed the Waal River. From the Belgian border to Nijmegen was 55 kilometers. They'd traveled 55 kilometers in 63 hours. The operational plan allocated 36 hours to reach that point. They were 27 hours behind schedule. And the most difficult objective, crossing the Waal River under fire, then advancing the remaining 15 kilometers to Arnhem, still lay ahead. The schedule wasn't slipping. It had already collapsed. But no one at Corps headquarters or higher was willing to state the obvious conclusion. Market Garden had failed its logistical prerequisites before the first shot was fired in anger. And no amount of tactical excellence or soldier courage could compensate for the fact that the road wasn't wide enough, and the trucks weren't numerous enough, and the bridges weren't strong enough, and the fuel wasn't sufficient. Captain Carrington's position reports documented all of this in real time, filed hourly with bureaucratic precision, creating a paper trail that historians would later use to reconstruct exactly when the operation became unrecoverable. That moment, if I had to assign a specific timestamp, was approximately 1800 hours on September 18th, when the Sun Bridge was discovered demolished and the Bailey Bridge construction began. At that moment, even if everything else had gone perfectly, there wasn't enough time remaining to reach Arnhem before 1st Airborne Division's ammunition ran out. The race was lost, but the column kept moving because stopping would have required admitting failure, and institutional momentum carried them forward into disaster. Chapter 10. Nijmegen's Crossing. The 20th of September, 1944, 1300 hours. A warehouse in Nijmegen, where American paratroopers from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment stared at 26 canvas assault boats stacked in the corner like oversized kayaks. The boats were British Army storm boats, designed for crossing rivers under fire, a specialized piece of equipment that no one in Major Julian Cook's 3rd Battalion had ever trained with. Cook himself, standing next to the pile of boats, was reading the instruction manual while his company commanders looked over his shoulder and tried to understand how 19-foot plywood boats were supposed to carry 13 fully equipped paratroopers each across 400 meters of fast-moving water under direct German machine gun fire. The manual was written in the passive voice bureaucratese of technical documentation. Boat shall be carried to water's edge by assigned crew. Paddles shall be distributed. 1 paddle per 2 men. Crossing shall commence on command. The manual did not address what to do when the assigned crew had never seen a storm boat before that morning and had approximately 90 minutes to learn waterborne assault tactics before H-hour. The Waal River at Nijmegen was 400 meters wide, with a current running at approximately 1.8 meters per second, flowing west toward the sea. That current meant crossing time would be longer than simple distance divided by rowing speed. Boats would be pushed downstream even as they moved forward, requiring crews to aim upstream and row at an angle to compensate for drift. Cook calculated 3.7 minutes for crossing at perfect rowing speed, but perfect assumed experienced crews in optimal conditions. Actual crossing time with overloaded boats and soldiers who'd never rowed before would be closer to 6 minutes. 6 minutes exposed to every German machine gun, mortar, and artillery piece with line of sight to the river. The calculus was simple and terrible. Some boats would make it across, some wouldn't, and there was no way to know which category any specific boat would fall into until the machine guns opened fire. The operation had arrived at this point through a combination of tactical necessity and inter-service disagreement. The Guards Armored Division, having finally reached Nijmegen on September 19th, found both bridges over the Waal intact, but the northern approaches held by German forces dug into buildings with excellent fields of fire. British tank commanders refused to attempt a bridge assault without infantry support, and infantry support required clearing the northern bank first, which meant someone had to cross the river, seize the northern bank, and allow the tanks to advance. Brigadier General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, volunteered his paratroopers for the assault. Not because he thought it would work, the casualties would be horrific, but because the alternative was the entire operation stalling at Nijmegen, while 1st Airborne Division died at Arnhem. Cook's 3rd Battalion drew the assignment: cross the Waal in canvas boats under fire, seize the northern bank, capture the railroad bridge, and link up with British tanks crossing the road bridge. Simple in concept, nearly impossible in execution. The boats arrived at 1300 hours, delivered by British Army trucks that had to navigate through Nijmegen's shattered streets to reach the warehouse. The boats were supposed to arrive on September 18th, in time for a dawn crossing on the 19th. Traffic on Highway 69 delayed them by 24 hours. That delay gave German forces time to reinforce the northern bank, position machine guns to cover the river approaches, and prepare for exactly the kind of assault Cook was about to execute. Every advantage the assault plan depended on, surprise, speed, coordination with British tank attack, had been eroded by the logistics failures that plagued the entire operation. Now, at 1300 hours on the 20th, Cook was being told to execute an improvised river crossing with no training, inadequate equipment, and defensive positions that had been given 30 hours to prepare. 1500 hours, H-hour. The first wave launched from the southern bank of the Waal, with 260 men in 26 boats. The British storm boat was designed for 8 infantry with equipment. Cook was loading 13 men per boat because there weren't enough boats to carry the entire battalion in one wave. 13 men with weapons and ammunition and equipment meant the boats sat low in the water, freeboard reduced to approximately 4 inches. Any wave action or bullet hole would cause immediate swamping. The paddles were designed for 8-man crews with coordinated rowing. 13-man crews meant too many paddles, not enough room. Soldiers getting in each other's way while trying to propel boats that handled like bathtubs. The after-action report describes the first 30 seconds. Boats launched, German machine guns opened fire from both banks and from the bridge superstructure, Water churned white with bullet impacts. Screaming started. 4 minutes into the crossing, the first boats reached the northern bank. 13 of 26 boats made it. The other 13 were sunk, drifting, disabled, or foundering with casualties too severe to continue. Cook's after-action report lists 48 killed during the crossing itself, with approximately 80 wounded. That's 48 men dead in 4 minutes, a casualty rate approaching 50% for the assault wave. The men who reached the northern bank weren't safe. German machine guns continued firing from improved positions on the high ground. But at least they had cover, could maneuver, could fight back. The second wave launched 10 minutes later with survivors from the first wave rowing back across to retrieve additional troops. By 1600 hours, Cook had approximately 300 men on the northern bank, badly disorganized but moving inland to engage German defensive positions. The German defenders weren't prepared for the sheer violence of the American assault. German military doctrine emphasized firepower and defensive positions, assuming that casualties would break attacking formations and force them to withdraw. The Americans didn't withdraw. They took horrific casualties and kept coming, kept firing, kept moving forward, even as men around them fell. Sergeant Theodore Finkbeiner's testimony, recorded years later, captures the psychology. "We knew if we stopped moving, we'd all die, so we kept moving. Didn't think about it, just kept moving." That's not courage in the traditional sense. Courage implies a conscious choice to face danger. This was survival instinct operating in circumstances where the only option was forward. Stopping meant death. Retreating meant death. Going forward might mean death too, but at least it was movement, action, agency. The psychological term is fight, flight, freeze. But in Nijmegen, there was no flight option, and freezing guaranteed death. So they fought. 1,630 hours. American paratroopers reached the northern approach to the railroad bridge and found it defended by a German platoon that had not yet realized the assault force was behind them. Brief firefight. Germans surrendered or withdrew. Bridge secured. Simultaneously, British tanks from the Grenadier Guards began crossing the road bridge from the south, engaging German positions on the northern bank with direct tank fire. The coordination wasn't perfect. American and British forces had minimal radio contact and were mostly acting on initiative rather than synchronized plan. But both elements converged on the bridge objectives within 30 minutes of each other. By 1700 hours, both bridges were in Allied hands. The road to Arnhem was open. 15 kilometers of Highway 69 stretched north from Nijmegen to Arnhem, undefended, passable. 30th Corps could now advance to relieve 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Could, theoretically. In practice, they didn't. There's a source conflict in the casualty figures that needs acknowledging because it reflects how military organizations count their losses. Cook's official after-action report lists 48 killed during the river crossing itself. The casualty lists compiled after the war and cross-referenced with grave registration records show 31 confirmed deaths during the crossing, with additional 17 men listed as died of wounds in the hours and days following. Both numbers are accurate depending on how you define killed during crossing. Is it only men who died in the water? Or does it include men who made it across but died from wounds sustained during the crossing? For historical accounting, the distinction matters. For the men who crossed the Waal in canvas boats under machine gun fire, the distinction was meaningless. They were casualties of the crossing, regardless of when their hearts stopped beating. What strikes me most forcefully when I examine the Nijmegen crossing is the contrast between tactical success and operational failure. The assault worked. Cook's battalion accomplished an objective that military planners would normally consider near impossible, crossing a major river in daylight under direct fire, with improvised boats and no training, then seizing fortified positions on the far bank. It was a tactical masterpiece executed by soldiers who refused to accept that the operation was impossible. And yet operationally, it didn't matter. The crossing succeeded on September 20th. 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem needed relief by September 19th to survive intact. The one-day delay, caused by the boats arriving late, caused by traffic on Highway 69, caused by bridges at Sun and Grave requiring repair, caused by every accumulated delay of the previous 3 days, meant that tactical success came too late to achieve operational objectives. The road to Arnhem was open on the 20th, but by then the perimeter at Arnhem had already collapsed into an unsustainable defensive position. Heroism cannot compensate for operational miscalculation. Cook's men paid in blood for a bridge that should have been seized 3 days earlier when German defenses were minimal and 1st Airborne Division still had ammunition and hope. Instead, they paid on the 20th when it was already too late to matter strategically, and their extraordinary courage accomplished nothing, except demonstrating that Americans could do the impossible when it no longer made a difference. Chapter 11. Urquhart's Island. The 17th of September, 1944, 1930 hours. Major General Roy Urquhart sat in the passenger seat of a jeep driving through the streets of Oosterbeek, trying to locate 1st Parachute Brigade headquarters. The jeep belonged to Divisional Headquarters, requisitioned that morning from the glider loads. Urquhart's driver was a corporal whose name doesn't appear in any of the documents I've found. The third man was Brigadier Gerald Lathbury, Deputy Division Commander, who'd insisted on accompanying Urquhart because someone senior needed to coordinate with the brigade. Neither man questioned the decision to drive into Oosterbeek, despite radio communications having already failed and no one knowing exactly where German forces were positioned. The operational assumption was that German resistance would be light and disorganized, scattered remnants from retreating units, nothing that could threaten a divisional commander's vehicle. That assumption was wrong. Within 30 minutes, Urquhart's jeep encountered German troops, took fire, and had to abandon the vehicle. For the next 40 hours, the commanding general of 1st Airborne Division was isolated, unreachable, and functionally removed from command of the battle he was supposed to be directing. The diary of Anton Dirksen, a Dutch civilian living in Oosterbeek, provides the civilian perspective on what happened next. Dirksen's entry for September 17th to 18th is matter of fact. 2 British officers came to our house after dark. One is wounded in the leg. The other is older, maybe 40, with red tabs on his uniform. He says they are cut off. We hide them in the attic. He does not tell us he commands the entire division. Red tabs, the insignia of a British General Staff officer. Dirksen didn't know he was harboring the division commander. Urquhart didn't volunteer the information because revealing his identity would only increase the danger to the family if Germans searched the house. For approximately 14 hours, from 2200 on the 17th until 1400 on the 18th, Urquhart hid in the Dirksen attic, watching the battle through a small window while German patrols moved through the street below. He could see British soldiers fighting, could hear radio transmissions from German units, could observe the battle developing exactly as he'd feared when he saw the intelligence photographs about German armor. And he could do nothing. Brigadier Lathbury, wounded during the same engagement that forced Urquhart into hiding, was captured by German forces on September 18th morning. He survived, would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner, but his capture meant that 1st Airborne Division was now without both its commander and deputy commander. The chain of command should have been clear. If both top officers are unavailable, the most senior brigade commander assumes command. But should requires working communications to inform subordinates who is now in command. With radios non-functional, battalion commanders didn't know Urquhart was missing until hours after he disappeared. They certainly didn't know Lathbury had been captured. Each unit was making independent decisions based on the last orders they'd received, fighting isolated battles without coordination, without any understanding of the division-level situation. To me, the most disturbing aspect isn't that Urquhart got isolated. Battlefield friction happens, commanders make bad decisions, vehicles get ambushed. The disturbing aspect is that the command structure had no resilience. One jeep encounter with German forces effectively decapitated the entire division. The attic where Urquhart spent September 18th was approximately 4 meters by 3 meters, with a ceiling so low he couldn't stand upright. The Dirksen family continued their normal routines downstairs, cooking, eating, trying to maintain an appearance of civilian normalcy, while British and German soldiers fought in the streets outside. Dirksen's diary mentions German soldiers entering the house twice during the day, searching for British troops or supplies. Both times, the family managed to deflect attention from the attic. The British officers stayed silent, barely breathing, while German voices conversed in the rooms below. Urquhart's memoir, written years later, describes the psychological stress, not fear of death, which was constant throughout the battle, but frustration at being unable to command. He could see the division fighting. He could see them making mistakes. He could see opportunities being missed, and he was powerless to intervene because he was hiding in a civilian's attic waiting for German patrols to leave. September 18, 1930 hours. Approximately 24 hours after Urquhart left divisional headquarters, he managed to return. The route was circuitous, moving through gardens and back alleys, avoiding German patrols and checkpoints, guided by Dutch civilians who knew the neighborhood. When he arrived back at headquarters, established in the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek, he found the situation had deteriorated beyond his worst projections. Frost's battalion was isolated at the bridge with no resupply and no communications. The rest of 1st Parachute Brigade had been stopped short of Arnhem, unable to break through German defenses to reach Frost. The Polish Parachute Brigade had been delayed by weather and wouldn't arrive until the next day. The perimeter around Oosterbeek was under continuous German pressure and shrinking. Urquhart's first question when he arrived at headquarters: "What's the situation at the bridge?" The answer: no contact for 12 hours. No one knew if Frost was alive, dead, or captured. No one knew if the bridge was still held or had fallen. The radio silence was absolute. There's a source conflict about Urquhart's departure on the 17th that reveals how command decisions get documented or not documented, depending on who survives to tell the story. Urquhart's post-war memoir claims he instructed officers at divisional headquarters before departing, designating who would assume temporary command if he was delayed. The divisional signals log shows no record of any such instruction, no written order, no radio transmission, no entry in the war diary confirming command delegation. Either Urquhart's memory is reconstructing events to show he acted appropriately, or the instructions were given verbally and no one thought to document them, or the documentation was lost in the chaos. What's certain is that subordinate commanders didn't know who was in command for the critical 24 hours of September 17th to 18th. Multiple officers later claimed they thought they were in command during that period, giving contradictory orders to different units, creating confusion that compounded the communications breakdown. British Army Command Protocol, codified in field regulations that every officer theoretically understood, specified that if a division commander was unreachable for more than 2 hours, the deputy commander assumed command automatically. If the deputy commander was also unreachable, the most senior brigade commander assumed command. The protocol was designed to prevent exactly the kind of command paralysis that occurred at Arnhem. But the protocol assumed working communications. With radios non-functional, no one could confirm who was reachable and who wasn't. Battalion commanders operating independently didn't know whether their orders to retreat or advance or hold position were being countermanded by someone higher in the chain who they couldn't communicate with. The command structure dissolved into improvisation, which sometimes works tactically but never works operationally, because operations require synchronized action across multiple units. Tactical improvisation produces local successes. Operational improvisation produces chaos. When I try to understand the psychology of a general watching his division die from an attic window, I struggle with competing interpretations. One reading is that Urquhart made a reasonable decision that went badly. He needed to locate his brigade headquarters, communications were down, driving was the only option. The decision was defensible until it failed. The alternative reading is that Urquhart made a fundamentally flawed decision that revealed deeper problems with his command judgment. Leaving divisional headquarters during a communications crisis was reckless regardless of outcome, and his subordinates paid the price for his poor judgment. Both readings are supportable from the same facts. The difference is whether you judge commanders by their intentions or by their results. Intentions were reasonable. Results were catastrophic. Urquhart survived, physically and professionally, remaining in command through the evacuation and receiving no official censure. But his 40-hour absence during the critical phase of the operation represents one of those individual decisions that cascades into operational failure. Would 1st Airborne Division have succeeded if Urquhart had stayed at headquarters? Probably not. The problems were too fundamental, too structural. But they definitely couldn't succeed without their commander, and the decision to leave removed any possibility of coordinated divisional action during the critical first 48 hours. Dirksen's wife offered Urquhart civilian clothes on September 18th, suggesting he could escape by blending in with Dutch civilians evacuating the battle zone. Urquhart refused. The explanation in his memoir is precise. If captured in civilian clothing, he could be executed as a spy under the laws of war. His only protection was his British uniform with its general officer insignia. Better to risk capture as a uniformed combatant than guarantee execution as a spy. The logic was sound, but it meant Urquhart spent the hiding period as a very visible target if discovered. A Dutch civilian could hide in plain sight. A British general in uniform could not. The choice reflects the constraints of military law and honor codes, constraints that made perfect sense in peacetime, but created impossible situations in combat. Urquhart was trapped by his uniform, which both protected him and made him conspicuous, and he spent those hours in the attic understanding that his best-case scenario was capture, and his worst case was death, while in between those extremes lay the ongoing destruction of his division. That's the particular isolation of senior command. You're responsible for thousands of men, but sometimes your responsibility manifests as helplessness, watching disaster unfold while unable to intervene because you made one bad decision 24 hours earlier that you cannot now reverse. Chapter 12. The Corridor Bleeds. The 19th of September, 1944, 2200 hours. The town of Wegel, approximately midway between Eindhoven and Nijmegen on Highway 69, where Corporal William Judd of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment sat in a foxhole at the edge of town, staring into darkness and listening for engine sounds. Judd's battalion had taken Wegel on September 17th in approximately 2 hours of fighting. German resistance had been minimal, a rear-guard force that withdrew rather than defending the town. The operation had felt successful. Objective seized quickly, minimal casualties, American paratroopers controlling a critical highway junction. 48 hours later, Judd was still in Wegel, not because he'd chosen to stay, but because German counterattacks kept coming. The mission had shifted from offensive to defensive without anyone officially changing the orders. His letter home, dated September 25th, but describing events of the 19th through 22nd, captures the transition. We took this town in 2 hours. We've been fighting to keep it for 4 days. Germans attack every night. We can't sleep. Every road junction is a target. I don't think anyone in command realized we'd have to defend 60 miles of highway. The German counterattack at 2200 hours on September 19th was the 1st 107th Panzer Brigade, a hastily assembled formation built around remnants of units that had retreated from France. The War Diary of 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment records the attack. Approximately 20 vehicles with infantry support, approaching from the east, objective apparently to cut Highway 69 and isolate American units north of Wegel from supply columns to the south. The attack succeeded. For approximately 8 hours, from 2200 on the 19th to 0600 on the 20th, the highway was cut. No traffic could move north or south through Wegel. Supply convoys destined for Nijmegen sat stalled while the American paratroopers fought to reopen the road. 8 hours of downtime translated directly into 8 hours of additional delay for 30th Corps, 8 hours that 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem didn't have. The pattern repeated at multiple points along Highway 69 over the next 4 days. September 20th to 21st, attacks at Sun and Uden and Wegel again. September 22nd, 6-hour battle at Koevering, midway between Wegel and Uden, where German assault guns engaged American positions from approximately 0400 until 1000 hours. September 23rd, ambush of a British supply convoy near St. Uden Road, 37 vehicles destroyed, according to Guards Armored Division War Diary. The Germans weren't trying to defeat Allied forces in direct combat. They didn't have the strength. They were attacking the supply line, creating interruptions, forcing American paratroopers to divert from offensive operations to defensive actions. Every road junction became a position that had to be defended around the clock. Every village became a potential ambush site. The corridor wasn't a secure rear area. It was an active combat zone, extending 64 miles from the Belgian border to Nijmegen. The defensive mathematics were impossible. 101st Airborne Division, responsible for defending the southern section of the corridor, fielded 3 parachute infantry regiments, totaling approximately 7,200 men. The highway corridor was 64 miles long. 7,200 men divided by 64 miles equals 112 men per mile, which equals 1 man every 47 feet if defenders were evenly distributed. Of course, defenders couldn't be evenly distributed. They had to concentrate at key points like road junctions and bridges, which meant large sections of highway were effectively undefended except by mobile patrols. German planners understood this. Their counterattack doctrine in fluid situations emphasized Kampfgruppe formations, battle groups of 200 to 400 men with attached armor, designed to strike road junctions at night, cause maximum disruption, then withdraw before dawn. The tactic created continuous operational tempo exhaustion for the defenders, who could never rest because attacks came every night from unpredictable directions. Judd's letter describes the psychological toll. We can't sleep. Every noise is a German tank. Every shadow is infantry. We've been on 50% alert for 4 days, which means half the company is awake at all times. But actually, everyone is awake, because no one can sleep when they can hear firing 2 miles away. 50% alert is the doctrinal standard for units in contact with the enemy. Half the men rest while half stand watch, rotating every few hours. The doctrine assumes that soldiers can actually sleep during their off-duty hours. In practice, sustained combat stress destroys the sleep cycle. Men become hyper-vigilant, unable to relax even when they're supposed to be resting. After 4 days of continuous alerts and nightly attacks, Judd's company was approaching psychological exhaustion, the point where combat effectiveness degrades not from casualties, but from accumulated fatigue. The supply convoy ambush on September 23rd revealed how vulnerable the corridor had become. A British convoy of 42 trucks carrying ammunition and fuel was moving north from Eindhoven to Nijmegen when it was engaged by German forces near St. Uden Road. The after-action report describes a coordinated ambush. Anti-tank guns positioned to engage the lead vehicles, machine guns covering the length of the convoy, infantry moving in to destroy immobilized trucks. The convoy escort, a platoon of British infantry in half-tracks, fought back but was outnumbered. 37 of 42 trucks were destroyed or damaged. 5 trucks escaped by reversing course and fleeing south. The ammunition and fuel that convoy carried were mission-critical supplies for operations at Nijmegen and eventually Arnhem. Losing 37 trucks worth of materiel meant units at the front went without resupply, meant rationing ammunition, meant postponing operations. The ambush was tactically minor. German forces probably numbered fewer than 200 men, but operationally significant, because it demonstrated that the supply line was attackable at any point along its length. There's a source conflict in the vehicle loss accounting that illustrates how different militaries count their losses differently. British records for September 19th through 23rd list 53 vehicles destroyed or damaged beyond repair along the Highway 69 corridor. German records for the same period claimed destroying 89 Allied vehicles. Both numbers are higher than peacetime operations could sustain, but they differ by 36 vehicles. The discrepancy likely reflects different counting methodologies. German spotters counted vehicles burning or abandoned, which might include vehicles only temporarily disabled. British quartermasters counted vehicles written off as total losses, which wouldn't include damaged vehicles that were repaired and returned to service. Neither number is necessarily wrong. They're measuring slightly different things. What both numbers confirm is that vehicle attrition along the corridor was unsustainable. Losing 53 to 89 vehicles in 5 days meant the Allies were hemorrhaging transportation capacity exactly when they needed maximum throughput to supply forward units. By September 24th, the corridor had consumed an entire division. The 7th Armored Division, the famous desert rats who'd fought in North Africa, were diverted from their planned role supporting the advance to Arnhem and instead assigned to secure Highway 69. An entire armored division with tanks and mechanized infantry and artillery support was now being used as a static defensive force protecting a supply route. That reallocation was the operational death knell for Market Garden. The forces that were supposed to exploit success were instead defending against failure. The relief force that was supposed to push through to Arnhem was stuck protecting the road that led to Arnhem. German intelligence had identified this vulnerability by September 18th, earlier than Allied commanders acknowledged it. OKW, German High Command, prioritized counterattacks on the corridor over defending Arnhem because they understood that strangling the supply line would kill the operation more effectively than direct combat at the objectives. Judd's letter ends with a single sentence that captures the transformation from offensive to defensive mindset. We're not advancing anymore. We're just holding. No dramatic phrasing, no philosophical reflection, just a factual observation about the operational reality. The 101st Airborne Division had been trained and equipped for offensive operations. Seize objectives, exploit success, maintain momentum. Instead, they were conducting defensive operations, hold positions, repel attacks, prevent enemy movement. Defensive operations consume resources differently than offensive operations. More ammunition expended per day because you're reacting to enemy initiative. More casualties from static positions that become targeted. More psychological stress from continuous alerts without clear end state. The division was being ground down not by a decisive battle, but by continuous low-intensity combat that produced steady attrition without resolution. When I map the casualty reports from 101st Airborne along the corridor, the pattern is consistent. 10 to 30 casualties per day, every day, for 2 weeks. Not dramatic losses, but unsustainable over time. By early October, the division had effectively been destroyed as a combat unit, not through a single defeat, but through accumulated attrition defending a highway that was supposed to be secured on September 18th, and instead remained contested until the operation was abandoned. The corridor bled, slowly and continuously, proving that holding ground is harder than taking it, and that supply lines are operational centers of gravity that determine strategic outcomes regardless of tactical successes elsewhere. Chapter 13. Oosterbeek Pocket. The 19th of September, 1944, approximately 1400 hours. The perimeter around Oosterbeek had contracted to a rough oval shape, 1.2 miles wide at its widest point, 1,600 yards deep from north to south, containing approximately 8,000 British soldiers who'd been unable to reach Arnhem Bridge and were now concentrated in a defensive position that was steadily shrinking under German pressure. Captain James Logan, Royal Army Medical Corps, commanding 16th Parachute Field Ambulance, sat in what had been the wine cellar of the Hartenstein Hotel, writing in his medical log with a pencil stub that he'd sharpened with his pocket knife. The log was supposed to track casualties, treatments, supplies consumed, and supplies remaining. By the 19th, it had become a chronicle of medical collapse. The entry for the previous 24 hours read, "Casualties treated last 24 hours, 247. Surgical procedures, 63. 14 amputations. Morphine supply, 32% remaining. Penicillin, depleted. Blood plasma, 11 units. Antiseptic, improvising with alcohol from looted homes. Expect cessation of surgical capability within 48 hours. The Oosterbeek perimeter wasn't planned. It was the accidental result of multiple battalion-sized elements being stopped short of their objectives and consolidating in the only area they could defend. 1st Airborne Division's operational plan called for seizing Arnhem Bridge and establishing a bridgehead that 30th Corps could drive through. Instead, the division had fragmented into isolated pockets. Frost Battalion at the bridge, cut off and unreachable, and everyone else compressed into Oosterbeek, a suburb that hadn't been designated as a defensive position because no one planned to defend it. The perimeter encompassed 1.9 square kilometers. 8,000 men in 1.9 square kilometers equals 4,200 men per square kilometer, which equals 1 soldier every 237 square meters. That population density under artillery fire created mass casualty conditions by definition. German gunners didn't need to aim precisely. They could fire into the general area of Oosterbeek and statistically guarantee hitting someone. The casualty rate from September 19th through 22nd averaged 120 to 180 wounded per day, not counting killed. Logan's medical log tracks the progression with clinical precision. September 19th, 147 casualties treated. September 20th, 193. September 21st, 212. September 22nd, 168. The variation day to day reflected German artillery tempo, not Allied defensive success. Some days the Germans fired more shells, some days fewer. But the bombardment was continuous, and the casualties accumulated regardless of how well British troops took cover. Artillery in urban terrain is uniquely lethal because buildings collapse, creating secondary fragmentation from brick and timber debris. Men could survive the initial shell burst and die from building collapse, or survive both and die from infection because antiseptic supplies were exhausted. By September 21st, the Hartenstein Hotel cellars had been converted into the main surgical facility. Major Guy Rigby Jones, a surgeon with peacetime experience in London hospitals, operated in what had been the wine storage room, a brick-vaulted space approximately 6 meters by 4 meters with a single bare light bulb powered by a gasoline generator that ran intermittently when fuel was available. His testimony, recorded after the war, describes the conditions. Operating table was a door removed from its hinges and placed across 2 wooden crates. Surgical instruments were whatever could be salvaged from medical packs, plus some tools borrowed from engineers. Pliers, wire cutters, anything that could cut or clamp. Anesthetic was morphine when available, nothing when morphine ran out. Rigby Jones performed 14 amputations on September 21st alone, working without breaks from 0600 until 2200 hours. 14 amputations in 16 hours of operating. That's less than 70 minutes per amputation, which sounds almost mechanical, except each operation involved a conscious decision to destroy a man's limb to save his life. The morphine depletion forced triage decisions that Logan's log documents with heartbreaking precision. British Army medical doctrine classified casualties into 3 categories. T1, immediate surgery required. T2, delayed surgery acceptable. T3, expectant, meaning minimal care provided because survival was unlikely. The categories were based on injury severity and available resources. In England, with full hospital facilities, T3 patients would receive aggressive treatment. At Oosterbeek by September 23rd, T3 meant will receive water and comfort but no surgery. Logan's log shows that approximately 40% of casualties on September 23rd were classified T3, not because their injuries were unsurvivable, but because medical supplies had been exhausted. The decision to classify a wounded man as expectant was functionally a death sentence. And that decision was being made based not on medicine, but on logistics. To me, reading through these medical logs decades later, that represents the clearest evidence of operational failure. When doctors are deciding who receives morphine based on supply shortages rather than medical need, the operation has already failed at every level that matters. September 23 brought the attempted drop of supplies by Royal Air Force transport aircraft. The operational plan called for supply drops into the perimeter to replenish ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The RAF flew the missions. Air crews were extraordinarily brave, flying through German anti-aircraft fire at low altitude to deliver supplies to the surrounded troops. But the perimeter had shrunk so dramatically that the planned drop zones were now outside British-held territory. The RAF log records that approximately 85% of supplies dropped on September 23 landed in German-held areas. British soldiers could see the parachutes deploying, could see crates landing 200 meters away, could watch German troops recovering the supplies that were meant to keep British troops alive. Some British soldiers attempted to retrieve the crates under fire. Most were killed or wounded in the attempt. The few crates that landed inside the perimeter contained mostly ammunition, useful, but not the medical supplies that Logan desperately needed. The supply system was functioning perfectly from an administrative perspective. Requests were filed, aircraft were dispatched, supplies were delivered to the designated coordinates. But the ground situation had changed faster than the supply system could adapt, and perfect execution of the wrong plan produced no material benefit. The German artillery targeting of medical facilities was systematic, not incidental. Logan's log notes on September 23, 3 shells hit Hartenstein Hotel between 1400 and 1600 hours. 2 shells hit buildings marked with Red Cross flags. Casualties among medical staff: 2 orderlies killed, 1 doctor wounded. The Geneva Conventions protected medical facilities marked with the Red Cross, prohibiting their deliberate targeting. German forces violated those conventions routinely at Oosterbeek, either because artillery observers couldn't distinguish marked buildings in the chaos, or because German commanders decided that medical facilities within a military perimeter were legitimate targets. Captured German fire plans, recovered after the battle, show specific coordinates for buildings marked as medical facilities. The targeting was deliberate. Red Cross flags made buildings more visible, not less, and German gunners used them as aiming points. The medical staff removed the Red Cross flags on September 24 because the flags were getting them killed. The German strength around Oosterbeek was estimated by British intelligence at approximately 2,000 to 3,000 troops. Post-war analysis of German unit records shows the actual number was closer to 6,400 troops, with 47 armored vehicles actively engaged in reducing the British perimeter. British intelligence was underestimating German strength by a factor of 2, which meant tactical decisions were being made based on incorrect assessments of the threat. Underestimation wasn't a failure of British intelligence officers. It was a structural problem of intelligence collection under communications blackout. Without aerial reconnaissance, without working radios to coordinate information from multiple observation posts, without any method to aggregate fragmentary sightings into a coherent order of battle, intelligence officers were making educated guesses based on incomplete data. Their guesses were wrong, but there was no mechanism to correct the errors, because correction requires information flow, and information flow requires communications infrastructure that had already failed. September 24 marked the psychological turning point, when most soldiers in the perimeter understood that relief wasn't coming. Judd's letter from Highway 69 had reached that conclusion on the 21st. Logan's medical log reaches it on the 24th with a single sentence added as a postscript to the daily casualty count. No resupply received. No communication with Corps. Suspect we are being evacuated or abandoned. That sentence, evacuated or abandoned, represents the binary outcomes that soldiers were contemplating. Either someone would organize a withdrawal and attempt to extract survivors, or the perimeter would be overrun and everyone would be killed or captured. The middle option, relief by 30th Corps, successful link-up, victory, was no longer considered possible by soldiers on the ground, even if commanders at higher headquarters hadn't yet admitted defeat. The perimeter size by September 24th had contracted to approximately 1.4 square kilometers, nearly 30% smaller than the 19th. 8,000 men compressed into 1.4 square kilometers meant defender density had increased to roughly 5,700 men per square kilometer, or one soldier every 175 square meters. At that density, artillery fire became a mathematical certainty of casualties. German gunners could fire blind and expect to hit concentrations of troops. The shrinking perimeter created a positive feedback loop. Casualties forced defensive positions to contract. Contraction increased density. Increased density made artillery more effective. More effective artillery caused more casualties, which forced further contraction. The loop had no stable equilibrium except total collapse. By September 25th, when evacuation orders were finally issued, the perimeter was on the verge of disintegration, not from being overrun by assault, but from being systematically destroyed by indirect fire that British forces had no effective counter against. Logan's final medical log entry, written on September 25th, just before the evacuation began, lists supplies remaining. Morphine sufficient for approximately 40 doses. No penicillin. No blood plasma. No antiseptic except captured German medical alcohol. Surgical instruments, down to 2 scalpels and 1 bone saw. Anesthetic, nil. He'd started the operation with medical supplies sufficient for a battalion-sized element operating independently for 72 hours. 9 days later, he had nothing except improvised tools and the knowledge that hundreds of wounded men would be left behind when the evacuation commenced because they couldn't walk and there were no stretchers to carry them. British doctrine called for medical personnel to remain with wounded who couldn't be evacuated, which meant Logan and his staff would become prisoners along with their patients. The alternative, abandoning wounded men without medical care, was unthinkable. So Logan prepared to surrender, organized his remaining supplies, ensured that casualty documentation was as complete as possible, so that families would eventually know what happened to their sons and husbands, and waited for German forces to arrive and accept his surrender. When I read his log, what strikes me hardest is not the medical catastrophe it documents, but the professionalism maintained throughout. Even facing certain capture, even knowing his patients would die in German custody at rates far higher than if proper medical care were available, Logan maintained accurate logs and proper documentation because that's what medical officers do. The bureaucracy of suffering, continuing until the very end. Chapter 14. The Evacuation Decision. The 24th of September, 1944, 0600 hours. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning's headquarters, 1st Airborne Corps, in the commandeered Dutch schoolhouse south of Nijmegen, where Brigadier Gordon Walsh sat at a desk reviewing casualty reports and situation summaries that painted an increasingly desperate picture of 1st Airborne Division's status. Walsh was Browning's intelligence officer, replacement for the original officer who'd been relieved before the operation. The same officer who'd shown Browning the photographs of German armor that Browning had dismissed. Walsh hadn't been involved in the planning, was inheriting someone else's disaster, and was now responsible for providing Browning with assessments that Browning didn't want to hear. His memo to Browning, timed at 0600 hours, was professionally written but unambiguous. Current estimate, 1st Airborne strength, 2,200 effectives. German strength estimate, 6,000 plus. Perimeter shrinking. Medical capability ceased. Ammunition critical. Request authority to prepare withdrawal plan. Urquhart concurs. Urgently. The word urgently was underlined in the original memo. I've seen the document in the archives at Kew, the carbon copy preserved with Walsh's personnel file. That underline represents a staff officer using every bureaucratic tool available to convey emphasis without being insubordinate. Walsh couldn't order withdrawal. That authority rested with Browning and ultimately with Montgomery at 21st Army Group. But Walsh could document his assessment, create a paper trail showing that someone recognized the situation was unsustainable, and force Browning to make an explicit decision rather than allowing drift to continue. The reply came back 5 hours later, timed at 1100 hours. Maintain position. 30th Corps advance continues. 5 words that sentenced men to death, not through malice, but through optimism that had become divorced from ground truth. Urquhart's signal requesting withdrawal authorization is recorded in 1st Airborne Division signals log at 2300 hours on September 23rd, 7 hours before Walsh's memo to Browning. The signal was brief, probably because radio communications were still intermittent and long messages risked being cut off mid-transmission. Perimeter situation critical. Require withdrawal within 48 hours or division lost. Request immediate authority. Urquhart. That signal represented the division commander admitting defeat, asking permission to extract his remaining troops before German forces overran positions or artillery destroyed the perimeter. The signal was received, acknowledged, but not acted upon. Browning's response, sent at 0200 hours on the 24th, was equally brief. Hold present positions. Relief imminent. Browning. Relief imminent. The same phrase that had been used since September 19th, now repeated on the 24th when everyone at Oosterbeek knew relief wasn't coming. The decision-making delays on September 24th reveal the layers of command authority that slowed response time to crisis. Walsh recognized the situation at 0600 and recommended withdrawal planning. Browning delayed decision pending consultation with Montgomery. Montgomery's headquarters didn't respond until 1600 hours on the 24th, 10 hours after Walsh's initial request. The delay wasn't Montgomery ignoring the situation. It was the communications and coordination lag inherent in having multiple headquarters separated by distance with imperfect communications infrastructure. By the time Montgomery's staff received Browning's query, analyzed the situation, drafted a response, and transmitted authorization back down the chain, crucial hours had been consumed. In those hours, approximately 137 men at Oosterbeek were killed or wounded, casualties that occurred during the bureaucratic delay between recognizing withdrawal was necessary and authorizing it to happen. Montgomery's authorization, when it finally arrived, was characteristically ambiguous. Withdrawal of 1st Airborne Division authorized if situation demands. Decision at Corps Commander discretion. All efforts to maintain bridgehead to continue until withdrawal executed. Translation: Montgomery was authorizing Browning to authorize Urquhart to withdraw, but phrasing it in language that preserved Montgomery's ability to claim later that he hadn't ordered withdrawal, that subordinate commanders had made the decision independently. This is the language of commanders protecting their reputations, making sure that failure can be attributed to execution rather than planning. Browning received Montgomery's authorization at 1800 hours on the 24th and transmitted withdrawal authority to Urquhart at 2000 hours. 2 hours later, demonstrating either that Browning needed time to coordinate with his staff or that Browning was psychologically reluctant to issue orders that represented admitted defeat. Urquhart received withdrawal authorization at approximately 2100 hours on the 24th. Operation Berlin, the code name for the evacuation, was scheduled to begin at 2200 hours on the 25th, giving troops 25 hours to prepare. That timeline wasn't arbitrary. It reflected how long engineers estimated they'd need to position boats, coordinate with Canadian engineers who were providing assault boats from the opposite bank, and brief units on evacuation procedures. 25 hours seems like adequate preparation time until you remember that communications were still degraded, that units were scattered across the perimeter without centralized coordination, and that German forces were conducting continuous attacks that made moving around the perimeter dangerous. Briefing battalion commanders required physically locating them, traveling to their positions under fire, delivering verbal orders because written orders might be captured, and reveal the evacuation plan to German forces. The evacuation would only work if it remained secret until execution, and maintaining secrecy required restricting information flow, which meant most soldiers didn't know they were evacuating until hours before it began. The source conflict about when withdrawal became inevitable appears in multiple memoirs and after-action reports. Browning's post-war memoir, published in 1956, claims, "I ordered withdrawal as soon as it became clear that 30th Corps could not break through in time. The decision was made at the earliest possible moment consistent with preserving hope for the surrounded troops." Walsh's memos and the signals logs tell a different story. Urquhart requested withdrawal on the 23rd. Walsh endorsed that request on the 24th morning. Browning delayed for 12 hours. Montgomery delayed for 10 hours. And authorization finally reached Urquhart on the 24th evening, 46 hours after Urquhart's initial request. 46 hours during which 437 men were killed or wounded defending positions that would be abandoned anyway. The discrepancy between Browning's memoir and the documentary record isn't necessarily dishonesty. Memory is self-serving, especially when recording events that reflect poorly on one's leadership. But the documents are unambiguous. Withdrawal was delayed by command hierarchy reluctance to admit defeat. Eisenhower's diary entry for September 24th, available in the Eisenhower Presidential Library archives, mentions Market Garden only in passing. Montgomery's operation in Holland experiencing difficulties. British Airborne Division isolated at Arnhem. Situation being monitored. That's the entire entry relating to Market Garden. No indication that Eisenhower understood a division was being destroyed. No sense of urgency. No suggestion that Supreme Headquarters was considering intervention or additional resources. The operational failure at Arnhem was being treated as a local British problem, not a theater-level crisis, which meant no one with Eisenhower's authority was pressuring Montgomery to authorize withdrawal earlier. The command structure had layers of bureaucracy that filtered information upward and diluted urgency at each level. By the time information reached Eisenhower, it had been processed through multiple headquarters, smoothed into professional military language that masked the desperation of the situation. Urquhart's signal said, "Division lost," if withdrawal didn't occur within 48 hours. Eisenhower's diary says, "Difficulties." When I calculate the timeline, the arithmetic is damning. Urquhart requested withdrawal at 2300 hours on September 23rd. Withdrawal authorization reached him at 2100 hours on September 24th. 46 hours elapsed. During those 46 hours, the division suffered approximately 437 additional casualties, according to Logan's medical logs and casualty returns. If withdrawal had been authorized on the morning of the 24th, when Walsh first recommended it, those 437 casualties might have been reduced, not eliminated, because the evacuation itself would be conducted under fire, but reduced because troops would have spent less time in the collapsing perimeter. How many of those 437 casualties would have survived if evacuation began 12 hours earlier? 20? 50? 100? The counterfactual is unknowable, but the moral calculus is clear. Command delay cost lives that could have been saved. The evacuation boats, Canadian assault boats provided by Canadian Army engineers, arrived at the Rhine River crossing point on the evening of September 25th. There were 37 boats total, each rated for 14 men. 37 boats times 14 men equals 518 men per crossing. 1st Airborne Division had approximately 2,163 men still alive and capable of movement. 4 crossings minimum to evacuate everyone, probably more because some boats would be lost to German fire or river current. 4 crossings at approximately 2 hours per crossing, time to load, cross, unload, return, equals 8 hours minimum. 8 hours of sustained evacuation operations under German observation and fire. The evacuation would only succeed if German forces didn't realize what was happening until too late to prevent it. The success rate depended on surprise, coordination, and luck. None of those factors were reliably controllable. September 25th, 2200 hours, 0 hour for Operation Berlin. Troops began moving to the evacuation point in darkness, using tape laid on the ground to mark routes through the perimeter. Strict noise discipline. No talking, No equipment rattling, no lights. German forces were less than 200 meters away in some sectors. Any noise could alert them to movement and trigger artillery. The evacuation was organized by unit. Each battalion allocated a crossing time and briefed on procedures. Some units didn't receive the order, communications were still degraded, and messengers couldn't reach every position. Those men would be left behind, still fighting at their positions, while the rest of the division evacuated. They'd figure out eventually that they were alone, that everyone else had left, and they'd surrender or attempt to escape independently. The evacuation plan didn't account for men who didn't receive orders. The plan assumed perfect information flow, which was exactly what the entire operation had lacked from the beginning. By 0500 hours on September 26th, the last boats had crossed. 2,163 men extracted, approximately 1,485 killed throughout the operation, 6,854 captured or missing. The casualty rates work out to roughly 65% of the division killed, wounded, or captured, a level of loss that would classify the division as destroyed for administrative purposes. 1st Airborne Division would be reconstituted later with new personnel, but the unit that dropped at Arnhem on September 17th ceased to exist as a combat-effective formation on September 26th. The evacuation was tactically successful. The operation went undetected until nearly complete. Most men designated for evacuation were extracted, but strategically meaningless. The objective was to seize Arnhem Bridge and hold it for 30th Corps. The bridge had fallen on September 21st. The division had been destroyed by September 26th. The operation failed utterly, and the evacuation was merely the administrative cleanup of failure. Who bears moral responsibility for the 48-hour delay between recognizing failure and authorizing withdrawal? Browning for delaying decision? Montgomery for being slow to authorize? The command structure itself for requiring multiple layers of approval for decisions that ground commanders could see were urgent? All of the above, probably. Institutional diffusion of responsibility means everyone is responsible and therefore no one is accountable. And 437 men died during the institutional paralysis that characterizes military bureaucracy at war. Chapter 15. The Bridge Falls. The 20th of September 1944, 2100 hours. The northern approach to Arnhem Bridge, where 2nd Parachute Battalion had held positions for approximately 72 hours, though held was becoming definitional rather than factual, because German forces were systematically destroying the buildings that provided British defensive positions. Captain Eric Mackay's diary, he commanded the engineer detachment attached to Frost's battalion, records the situation with professional detachment. Bridge position no longer tenable. Ammunition for small arms, 20 to 30 rounds per man. Piot bombs, 4 remaining. Water supply, none since yesterday. Buildings burning. Germans bringing up self-propelled guns. Direct fire at ranges under 100 meters. Colonel Frost wounded, command devolving. Last radio message to Division HQ, acknowledged, but no reply. The phrase, "no reply," carried implications that Mackay didn't elaborate on in writing, but understood completely. Division headquarters either couldn't respond or had stopped trying to communicate with a position they'd written off as lost. The German attacks on September 19th and 20th had shifted from infantry assaults to systematic demolition. Tiger tanks. The Germans had brought up 2 Tiger tanks overnight on the 19th. Massive vehicles mounting 88mm guns had positioned themselves at the southern end of the bridge and were firing directly at buildings on the northern approach. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate nearly any armor and could certainly penetrate brick walls. The tactic was methodical. Fire at building foundations until the structure collapsed. Move to the next building. Repeat. British soldiers could hear the tanks firing, could hear the shells impacting, could feel buildings shake from near misses. When a building took a direct hit, the structure didn't explode dramatically. It sagged and then collapsed floor by floor, creating avalanches of brick and timber that buried anyone inside. Some men were pulled out alive, most weren't. By the evening of the 20th, half the buildings that 2nd Battalion had occupied on the 17th were rubble. Lieutenant Colonel Frost was wounded on the 20th by mortar fire, shrapnel wounds to the legs, severe enough to prevent him from walking, but not immediately life-threatening. Major Douglas Goff assumed command of what remained of the battalion. Goff's first situation assessment, recorded in the war diary, was grimly precise. Effective strength approximately 217 men. Ammunition critical. No resupply since 17th. Water exhausted. Medical supplies nil. Casualties cannot be evacuated. Estimate 6 to 12 hours before position overrun. 217 men from an initial strength of 643. The losses weren't primarily from direct combat. They were from accumulation. Men wounded who became non-effective. Men killed by artillery or building collapses. Men captured when isolated positions were cut off from the main perimeter. The battalion was dissolving through attrition, and there was no mechanism to stop the dissolution because no reinforcements existed and no resupply was possible. September 21st, 0600 to 1000 hours. German assault with flamethrowers. The war diary entry is laconic. Enemy employing flame weapons against riverside buildings. 3 buildings set ablaze. Personnel forced into basements. Flamethrowers weren't random weapons. They were psychological tools designed to force defenders out of cover. A building under flamethrower attack became uninhabitable within minutes. The heat alone made breathing impossible, and smoke inhalation would kill even if flames didn't. British soldiers in buildings under flamethrower assault had 2 options. Evacuate to basements where they'd be trapped but temporarily safe from flames, or evacuate the building entirely and fight in the open where German machine guns could engage them. Neither option was survivable long-term. The Germans weren't trying to kill British soldiers efficiently. They were trying to make continued defense psychologically impossible, breaking resistance through terror rather than firepower. 1030 hours, German loudspeaker propaganda. This detail appears in multiple survivor testimonies, suggesting it was significant enough to be remembered decades later. German psychological warfare teams set up loudspeakers at the southern end of the bridge and broadcast messages in English. Surrender offers, promises of medical treatment for wounded, warnings that continued resistance was futile. The messages were professionally produced. The English was fluent. The tone was reasonable rather than threatening. The content was designed to prey on soldiers' rational calculation of survival odds. A wounded British soldier, in a basement with no ammunition and no food, listening to German loudspeakers promise medical care if he surrendered, faced a genuine moral dilemma. Continue resisting pointlessly and die, or surrender and possibly survive. The propaganda was effective not because it changed British soldiers' loyalty, but because it articulated what they were already thinking. 1200 hours, September 21st. The last organized resistance ended. The war diary, maintained until the final hours, records approximately 200 men in isolated pockets, no communication between pockets, ammunition exhausted except small arms. Major Goff attempting to organize breakout to south, most personnel too wounded to move. The phrase, attempting to organize, is doing significant work in that sentence. Organization implies command structure, coordinated action, units following orders. What actually happened was closer to disintegration. Small groups making independent decisions about surrender or attempted escape. No central coordination. No communication except shouted conversations between adjacent buildings. Some groups surrendered when Germans approached with white flags and offered terms. Some groups fought until ammunition was exhausted and then surrendered. Some individuals attempted to escape by swimming the Rhine or hiding in basements hoping to be overlooked. The battalion ceased to exist as a military unit sometime between noon and 1400 hours on September 21st, though pinpointing the exact moment is impossible. Because organizational collapse is a process, not an event. The source conflict in the timeline appears when comparing British reports with German records. British after-action reports claim 2nd Battalion held for over 3 days, technically accurate if you count from arrival at the bridge on September 17th at 2000 hours until final surrender on September 21st at approximately 1400 hours. 85 hours. German records, specifically the War Diary of 9th SS Panzer Division, show last radio contact with British forces at the bridge occurring at 0900 hours on September 21st, with final surrender completed by 1300 hours. German records count holding time as the period during which organized resistance continued, which by their measure was closer to 80 hours. 4 hours difference in a battle that lasted days seems trivial, but it matters for historiography because over 3 days sounds more impressive than 80 hours. And British official histories consistently use the longer phrasing to emphasize the battalion's tenacity. Both phrasings are defensible from the same facts. The interpretive choice reveals institutional priorities, emphasize achievement to preserve morale and honor, even in defeat. Mackay's diary, the last entries were written on scraps of paper and hidden in his clothing before he surrendered, describes the final hours with attention to small details that larger histories miss. He notes that the last Piat anti-tank bomb was used on the morning of the 21st to destroy a German half-track that was positioning to fire into the basement where wounded were sheltering. 1 Piat bomb, 1 half-track destroyed, 1 temporary reprieve for men who would surrender hours later. He notes that the last functioning radio transmitted a message to division headquarters at 0830 hours. Out of ammo, God save the king. No response was received. The radio operator, whose name Mackay doesn't record, smashed the radio set with a rifle butt to prevent capture. These details, the last Piat bomb, the final radio message, the destroyed radio, don't appear in official histories because they're too small, too specific, too human. But they're what actually happened, the texture of defeat when observed at ground level rather than from headquarters perspective. The bridge itself was never demolition prepared by German forces, a fact that wasn't understood by British planners. German doctrine called for bridges to be wired with explosives during retreat, allowing demolition if the bridge couldn't be held. But Arnhem Bridge hadn't been prepared for demolition, because German commanders expected to use it for their own operations. Specifically, they anticipated needing the bridge for counteroffensives into Allied-held territory, once they'd stabilized their defensive lines. If Frost's engineers had been equipped with sufficient explosives, they could have demolished the bridge on September 18th or 19th, denying it to everyone. The operational paradox of Market Garden was that British forces fought to capture a bridge intact so that British armor could cross, while German forces fought to recapture the bridge intact so that German armor could cross. Both sides needed the bridge functional. If either side had been willing to destroy it, the battle would have ended differently. Arguably better for the British, since a destroyed bridge would have forced German forces to find alternate crossing points and might have reduced pressure on the Oosterbeek perimeter. But preservation of the bridge was the operational objective, so both sides fought to hold infrastructure that neither side could effectively use. When I read Mackay's diary, what strikes me hardest is the verb tense shift on September 21st. Earlier entries use present progressive. We are holding the bridge. We are under fire. Germans are attacking. The entry for the 21st shifts to simple past. We held for as long as possible. We fought well. We did our duty. That shift from present to past tense is the unconscious grammar of defeat, the linguistic marker of a soldier who's already processed that the fight is over, even if surrender hasn't formally occurred. Mackay wrote those final entries knowing they might be his last written words, wanting to document that 2nd Battalion had accomplished something, even though the accomplishment was ultimately tactical rather than strategic. They'd reached the bridge in time. They'd held it against odds. They denied German use of it for critical days, and none of it mattered operationally, because 30th Corps didn't arrive in time, because the radios didn't work, because the plan required perfection and reality delivered friction. Courage has a mathematical endpoint, measured in rounds of ammunition and hours of exposure and accumulated casualties that reduce effectiveness below sustainable levels. 2nd Battalion reached that endpoint on September 21st at approximately noon, and what happened afterward was administrative cleanup. Prisoners processed, wounded transported to German hospitals, dead buried in unmarked graves that would be identified and relocated years later. The bridge stood intact, captured by German forces who would hold it until Canadian troops seized it 7 months later in April 1945. Frost Battalion bought 4 days at a cost of 443 men killed, wounded, or captured. The mathematics of war are always terrible, but at Arnhem Bridge they were particularly cruel, because the sacrifice achieved nothing except demonstrating that sacrifice alone is insufficient. Chapter 16. The Tonnage of Failure. There are no people in this chapter, no named commanders, no soldiers with personal stories, no civilians watching from attics. This chapter is numbers speaking for themselves. The bureaucratic accounting of an operation measured in tons and gallons and casualties. The material reality behind strategic ambition. I'm presenting this as statistical autopsy, because sometimes the clearest way to understand failure is to strip away narrative and examine what actually moved, what was consumed, what was lost. The numbers don't lie, don't embellish, don't protect reputations. They simply are. Quartermaster Returns, 21st Army Group, dated 30th of September, 1944. Document reference BM/QM/421, filed in the National Archives under War Office Records. The report is formatted as a table with columns for authorized, delivered, consumed, and deficit. The ammunition line reads, authorized quantity for Operation Market Garden, 11,200 tons. Delivered to objective areas, 6,407 tons. Consumed in combat, 11,200 tons. Deficit, 4,793 tons. The deficit was sourced through emergency reallocation from 3rd Army and 9th Army, meaning Market Garden's ammunition shortfall was covered by borrowing from other operations, creating cascading shortages across the theater. Fuel accounting shows similar patterns. Authorized, 890,000 gallons of petrol. Delivered, 480,000 gallons. Consumed, 890,000 gallons. Deficit, 410,000 gallons. The fuel came from somewhere. Quartermaster records show emergency transfers from strategic reserves and diverted convoy shipments, but the transfers meant other operations went short. When 3rd Army complained in October that they couldn't maintain offensive momentum due to fuel shortages, the root cause was partially Market Garden's overconsumption during September. Operations don't exist in isolation. Resources are finite and zero-sum. Market Garden's deficit became someone else's shortage. Personnel committed to the operation, total across all services and nationalities, approximately 41,628 personnel. That number breaks down as 1st Airborne Division, 10,005 men, 82nd Airborne Division, 7,467 men, 101st Airborne Division, 6,695 men, Polish 1st Parachute Brigade, 1,568 men, 30th Corps Ground Forces, 15,893 men, RAF and USAAF aircrews not included in these totals, because aircrew were counted as supporting rather than committed forces, though obviously they were exposed to risk and suffered casualties. Casualty accounting for Market Garden has been contentious for decades because different sources count differently. British official history, published in 1958, lists total Allied casualties as approximately 17,000. When you aggregate casualties from separate national sources, British, American, Polish, the combined total is 19,234. The discrepancy comes from counting methodologies. British figures count only confirmed killed, wounded, and missing. American figures include injured who returned to duty within 72 hours, which British accounting excludes. Polish figures include civilians who were killed during the operation, which neither British nor American figures count. None of these methodologies is wrong. They're measuring slightly different populations. But the result is that stating total market garden casualties requires specifying which counting system you're using. British 1st Airborne Division casualties: 1,485 confirmed killed, 6,854 captured or missing, approximately 1,200 wounded who were evacuated during Operation Berlin. Total division casualties: approximately 9,400 men out of 10,005 men committed. That's a 94% casualty rate. For context, a military unit is considered combat ineffective at 30% casualties and destroyed at 50% casualties. 1st Airborne Division was destroyed twice over by standard metrics. American airborne divisions fared better statistically, but still suffered significantly. 82nd Airborne: 1,432 killed, wounded, or missing. 101st Airborne: 2,110 killed, wounded, or missing. The American casualties were concentrated in specific battles: the Vaal River crossing for 82nd, the corridor defense for 101st, rather than distributed evenly, which meant some battalions were effectively destroyed, while others remained combat capable. Aircraft losses tell part of the story that ground combat obscures. RAF and USAAF transport aircraft losses: 68 C-47 transport aircraft destroyed, 40 gliders destroyed during landing, 355 aircraft damaged requiring repair. The damaged aircraft represented approximately 30% of the transport fleet committed to the operation, which meant that follow-on airborne operations planned for autumn 1944 had to be canceled or scaled back due to insufficient transport capacity. Market Garden consumed not just the troops who fought, but the logistical capacity to conduct similar operations in the future. Vehicle losses from 30th Corps: 214 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. 873 trucks and support vehicles destroyed or damaged. The tank losses were split between combat attrition, German anti-tank weapons destroying vehicles during advances, and mechanical breakdowns that couldn't be repaired forward due to lack of spare parts. Highway 69's poor condition contributed significantly to mechanical failures. The cumulative stress of operating heavy vehicles on underrated pavement caused transmission failures, suspension damage, and track breakage at rates higher than expected. The logistics deficit calculated retrospectively: 6,503 tons of supplies required, but not delivered. That figure represents the gap between what the operation needed to succeed and what the logistics system could actually provide. Breaking down that deficit by category: 4,793 tons of ammunition, 1,300 tons of rations, 410,000 gallons of fuel converted to tonnage at 6.3 pounds per gallon, equals 1,294 tons of fuel. The sum doesn't quite equal 6,503 because different sources round differently, but the magnitude is consistent. The missing 6,503 tons represented exactly 1,734 lorry loads at 3.75 tons per vehicle. That number, 1,734, matches almost precisely the number of vehicles that Lieutenant Langton requested on September 10th and was denied. The operation failed by exactly the margin that was predicted in requisition forms before it began. Medical supply consumption reveals the human cost in different terms. 1st Airborne Division medical units expended: 48,000 individual field dressings, 17,000 morphine syrettes, 8,000 units of blood plasma, quantities of penicillin measured in millions of units. The medical supplies were calculated for 72 hours of combat operations. The division fought for 9 days. By September 23rd, medical supplies were exhausted. which meant wounded men received no treatment beyond basic first aid. Casualty survival rates dropped accordingly. In the first 3 days of the operation, approximately 85% of wounded who reached medical facilities survived. After September 23, when supplies were exhausted, survival rates dropped to approximately 60%. The additional 25% mortality, roughly 250 men, died not from unsurvivable wounds, but from lack of medical supplies. German losses are harder to quantify because German record-keeping during the retreat from France was incomplete, and because post-war researchers had limited access to German archives during the Cold War. Estimates of German casualties at Market Garden range from 3,300 to 8,000, depending on which units are counted and whether casualties include wounded who returned to duty. The wide range reflects genuine uncertainty rather than methodological disputes. What's certain is that German casualties were significantly lower than Allied casualties, which is normal for defensive operations where the defender has advantages of prepared positions and shorter supply lines. The fuel consumption figure deserves additional attention because it illuminates the operation's logistical impossibility. 890,000 gallons consumed over 9 days equals 98,889 gallons per day. A 3-ton lorry carrying fuel in jerry cans could transport approximately 200 gallons. 98,889 gallons divided by 200 gallons per truck equals 494 truckloads of fuel per day required just to maintain operations. That's 494 trucks that had to drive from supply dumps to forward units daily, every day, for 9 days. The trucks themselves consumed fuel during transit, approximately 8 miles per gallon for a laden Bedford QL, which meant the logistics system was consuming a significant portion of the fuel that was transporting. This is the paradox of extended supply lines. Beyond a certain distance, the logistics system consumes more resources than it delivers to combat units. The ammunition consumption rate, 11,200 tons over 9 days, works out to 1,244 tons per day. British artillery during sustained operations fired approximately 100 rounds per gun per day. 30th Corps artillery consisted of roughly 300 guns of various calibers. 300 guns times 100 rounds equals 30,000 rounds per day. A 105 mm howitzer shell weighs approximately 35 pounds. 30,000 rounds times 35 pounds equals 525 tons per day just for artillery, not counting small arms ammunition, tank rounds, mortar shells, or grenades. The actual consumption figure of 1,244 tons per day is high, but plausible when you account for all ammunition types and the intensity of combat operations. The casualties to supply ratio provides a metric for operational efficiency, though efficiency seems grotesque when applied to human death. Market Garden consumed 6,503 tons of supplies beyond what was delivered and produced 19,234 casualties. That's approximately 338 pounds of missing supplies per casualty. Or inverted, each ton of supply deficit corresponds to roughly 3 casualties. The correlation isn't causal. Bullets don't magically appear from wounded soldiers, but it illustrates the relationship between logistics shortfalls and operational outcomes. Insufficient supplies mean reduced combat effectiveness, which means higher casualties for reduced territorial gains. The bridge at Arnhem remained standing throughout the operation and afterward, captured intact by German forces on September 21st and held until Canadian forces seized it in April 1945. The bridge was worth, by engineering assessment, approximately £1 million sterling in 1944 currency. The cost to replace it if destroyed. 1st Airborne Division was worth, by the same accounting methodology, approximately 1,400 lives and 6,800 captured soldiers. The exchange rate was negative. Bridge preserved, division destroyed. Bridge held by the enemy anyway. Strategic objectives unmet. The final accounting appears in a memo from Montgomery to Eisenhower, dated 3rd of October 1944. Montgomery's assessment of Market Garden. Operation was 90% successful. That 90% figure has been disputed by historians ever since. Montgomery's logic was that the operation seized bridges at Eindhoven, Grave, and Nijmegen as planned, failing only at Arnhem. 4 objectives, 3 achieved, equals 75%, which Montgomery rounded up to 90% in his optimistic accounting. The flaw in this logic is that seizing 3 of 4 bridges doesn't accomplish the operational objective if the 4th bridge was the critical one. Market Garden was designed to create a corridor to the Ruhr, which required all bridges, including Arnhem. Seizing 3 bridges and failing at the 4th is strategic failure regardless of how many objectives were technically achieved. But Montgomery's 90% assessment entered the historical record and shaped interpretation of the operation for years afterward, demonstrating how commanders with institutional authority can reframe failure as partial success through selective accounting. I began this chapter promising numbers without narrative, but I find myself returning to interpretation, because numbers without context are meaningless. 6,503 tons of missing supplies is just a number, until you understand that it represents 1,734 truckloads that were requested, denied, and whose absence killed men who might otherwise have survived. 19,234 casualties is a statistic, until you remember that each casualty was a person with a name and family and future that ended on a Dutch road or in an Arnhem basement. The tonnage of failure is measurable, quantifiable, indisputable. But the meaning of failure, whether it was inevitable given the constraints or avoidable given better decisions, remains contested. What's not contested is that the arithmetic predicted failure before the first paratrooper boarded his aircraft. And the final accounting confirmed that prediction with precision that would be impressive if it weren't so damning. You cannot subtract 6,503 tons from an operation and expect addition. The mathematics are their own verdict. Chapter 17. The Archives Remember Differently. The copy of the British official history that sits in the reading room at the National Archives in Kew, London, is a well-worn volume, dark green cloth binding with "The Campaign in Northwest Europe" stamped in gold lettering on the spine. Published in 1956 by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, authored by L.F. Ellis with assistance from the Cabinet Office Historical Section. I opened it to the Market Garden chapter on a research visit in 2023, looking for the passage I'd read about in secondary sources. Page 347. Operation Market Garden, though unsuccessful in its final objective, demonstrated the flexibility and courage of Allied airborne forces and provided valuable lessons for future operations. Next to this passage, someone has written in pencil in the margin, "Rubbish," demonstrated the opposite. The handwriting is shaky, probably elderly. The notation is signed and dated, "A Veteran, 1958." That marginal note encapsulates the tension between official history and lived experience, between institutional memory and individual memory, between what organizations need to believe about their past and what participants know about what actually happened. Official histories are written by survivors with institutional interests, military establishments that need to maintain morale and justify decisions, governments that need to explain why resources were expended and lives lost, commanders who need to protect their reputations for future assignments. The result is history written with care, sometimes honest care, but always filtered through the lens of organizational self-preservation. The veteran who wrote "rubbish" in the margin was an early reader who recognized that the official narrative was smoothing failure into valuable experience, transforming disaster into education, protecting institutions at the expense of truth. The after-action reports compiled during 1945 and 46, while memories were fresh and the imperative for honesty was high, tell a different story than the official histories published a decade later. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Report, SHAEF/AAR/Market Garden, dated November 1944, identifies specific planning failures: inadequate intelligence distribution, insufficient logistics preparation, unrealistic timeline, Communications equipment unsuited to terrain. The report's conclusion: operation failed primarily due to planning assumptions that proved incorrect, rather than execution failures by combat units. That's a careful phrasing. Planning assumptions proved incorrect avoids blaming specific planners while acknowledging the plan was flawed. The report was classified restricted and distributed only to senior commanders, ensuring that the frank assessment wouldn't undermine public confidence or morale. Montgomery's memoir, published in 1958, presents a different narrative. Market Garden was a bold operation that came close to success. Had weather cooperated and had intelligence about German armor been more complete, the outcome would have been different. The operation demonstrated that airborne forces could seize and hold objectives against determined opposition. No mention of logistics failures. No acknowledgement that the single road advance was physically impossible given Highway 69's specifications. No recognition that the drop zones were too far from objectives. Montgomery's memoir was written for public consumption and for his own legacy, presenting Market Garden as a near success undermined by bad luck, rather than a fundamentally flawed plan executed despite warnings. 1974 brought a significant shift in Market Garden historiography, with Cornelius Ryan's A Bridge Too Far. Ryan was a journalist, not a military historian, and he approached the story through interviews with survivors, British, American, German, and Dutch civilians. The result was the first popular history that seriously criticized operational planning and command decisions. Ryan documented the intelligence failures, quoted Van der Veer's warnings about road capacity, exposed the drop zone compromises, and presented Montgomery's role as ambiguous at best. The book was controversial when published. British military establishment reviews criticized it as sensationalist and insufficiently appreciative of command complexity. But it shaped public understanding of Market Garden for generations. The 1977 film adaptation of Ryan's book cemented Market Garden in popular memory as a heroic failure rather than a planning disaster. The film emphasized soldier courage, showed dramatic combat sequences, and largely omitted the logistics discussions that Ryan's book had included. Film as a medium prioritizes visual drama over technical analysis, which meant audiences remembered Sean Connery and Anthony Hopkins fighting bravely at Arnhem, while forgetting that the operation failed because someone denied Langton's truck requisition on September 10th. Popular culture creates memory more powerfully than scholarship, and the film's legacy is that most people know Market Garden as that bridge movie, rather than as a case study in operational overreach. The source conflict about intelligence deserves particular attention because it reflects how evidence can be interpreted differently by honest historians. Montgomery's memoir claims he never received clear intelligence about German armor at Arnhem. Reports were fragmentary and conflicting. The photographic reconnaissance records declassified in the 1980s show that RAF Medmenham processed clear images of armor near Arnhem and forwarded typed summaries to 21st Army Group headquarters on September 12th. Either Montgomery didn't receive those summaries, possible if his staff filtered them out, or he received them and didn't consider them decisive, possible if he was committed to the operation regardless of intelligence. Post-war interviews with Montgomery's staff officers suggest the latter. The intelligence reached headquarters but was assessed as non-critical because the armor was estimated to be non-operational. That assessment was wrong, but it was made in good faith, based on available information. Montgomery's memoir claimed that he lacked intelligence is technically defensible. He lacked complete intelligence, but misleading because it implies ignorance when the reality was dismissal. The historiographical evolution continued through the 1980s and 90s as more archives opened. Dutch resistance records, published in the 1980s, confirmed that multiple reports about German armor near Arnhem had been filed through SOE channels. German military archives, gradually opened after reunification, provided German order of battle and strength returns that confirmed 2nd SS Panzer Corps had significant combat capability despite being officially in refit status. Polish military archives added details about the Polish parachute brigade's delayed drop and difficult combat after landing. Each new archive opening added complexity to the narrative, chipping away at the simple stories that official histories and memoirs had constructed. The modern historiographical consensus, represented by historians like Antony Beevor and Robert Kershaw writing in the 2000s and 2010s, is that Market Garden failed due to structural factors that were foreseeable and foreseen, but ignored. The intelligence existed. The logistics constraints were known. The drop zone compromises were documented. Senior commanders proceeded anyway because the strategic imperative, ending the war in 1944, seemed to justify the operational risks. This interpretation is less dramatic than either heroic near success or criminal blunder, but fits the evidence better. Market Garden was a calculated gamble that failed because the calculation was wrong, not because anyone was incompetent or cowardly, but because ambitious plans require perfect execution and war never provides perfection. What strikes me about Market Garden historiography is how long it took for institutional honesty to emerge. The British Army Staff College used Market Garden as a case study from 1948 through 1965, but the lessons were classified, restricted, meaning Staff College students could study the operation but couldn't cite it in public writings or speeches. The military establishment knew what had gone wrong. The internal studies are remarkably frank about planning failures, but didn't want junior officers using Market Garden as an example of senior commander failure. The restriction was lifted in the 1960s as the commanders involved retired or died, allowing more open discussion. But the two-decade delay meant that public understanding of Market Garden was shaped by memoirs and official histories written to protect reputations rather than by candid analysis. The comparison to modern corporate crisis management is instructive because the patterns are identical. When Boeing 737 MAX crashed in 2018 and 2019, early internal reports accurately identified the problem: MCAS system design interacting with pilot training deficiencies. But public communications emphasized safety culture and lessons learned, rather than acknowledging that regulatory capture and profit prioritization had led to insufficient testing. Only when congressional investigations forced disclosure did the full scope of institutional failure become public. Market Garden followed the same arc. Initial accurate after-action reports, public narratives emphasizing courage and lessons learned, delayed disclosure of planning failures, eventual historical consensus that institutions had prioritized ambition over realistic assessment. We're still learning this pattern, still repeating it, still creating situations where organizations protect their reputations by filtering truth through layers of public relations until the result bears limited resemblance to what actually happened. I began this research project believing I would narrate a battle, document a military operation with proper attention to chronology and causation and combat detail. Instead, I found myself excavating a cover-up, not a conspiracy. No one deliberately suppressed evidence or destroyed documents, but the institutional impulse to smooth disaster into valuable experience. The British Army needed to believe that Market Garden was a bold operation that failed narrowly, rather than a flawed plan that failed predictably. Montgomery needed to protect his reputation as a winning commander. The Allied command structure needed to maintain confidence that they could plan and execute complex operations. All of those needs were legitimate organizational priorities, but they produced a historical record where the initial documentation was accurate and the subsequent interpretation was filtered through institutional self-interest, creating a gap between what happened and what was officially remembered. The archives remember differently because archives preserve documents created in the moment without retrospective knowledge of how events concluded. Langton's requisition forms from September 10th say, "Shortfall, 1,400 lorries," not knowing that those missing lorries would cost lives at Sun Bridge. Vanderveer's road capacity memo doesn't know that Highway 69 will become a parking lot. Hill's reconnaissance photographs don't know they'll be ignored. The documents are innocent of their own significance, created by people doing routine paperwork who didn't realize they were documenting the foundations of disaster. Reading archives chronologically, Watching decisions accumulate into catastrophe produces a different understanding than reading memoirs written by commanders justifying their choices decades later. The veteran who wrote "rubbish" in the margin of the official history in 1958 is anonymous, just a signature that's illegible and a date. But that marginal note represents thousands of veterans who read official accounts and recognized that their experience had been sanitized into something more palatable.
The soldier who watched his friends die in a canvas boat on the Vaal River
Didn't need valuable lessons learned phrasing. He needed acknowledgement that the operation was badly planned and that senior commanders had gambled with lives and lost. The institutional history couldn't provide that acknowledgement, because institutions don't voluntarily accept blame. So the gap persists between official memory and participant memory, between what organizations say happened and what people who were there know happened. Archives preserve both memories, the official and the personal, and historians decide which to emphasize. I've tried to emphasize the documents that weren't written for history, the maintenance logs and requisition forms and casualty cards, because those documents tell truth accidentally, preserving reality without editorial filtering. Market Garden failed by the mathematics that Langton calculated on September 10th. Everything else is interpretation, and interpretation serves whoever controls the narrative. The numbers serve only themselves, and that's why I trust them.